On the morning of September 25, 1804, a red-haired Virginian with a sword in his hand stood on a riverbank in what is now South Dakota, an arrow aimed at his chest by the most feared war chief on the northern plains. Behind him, a single cannon loaded with grape shot pointed at 200 Sioux warriors who had strung their bows and painted their faces for war. The next 30 seconds would determine whether the greatest expedition in American history ended in massacre before it had crossed half the continent. William Clark had never imagined that announcing American sovereignty over Louisiana would nearly cost him his life. But here he was, staring into the eyes of Partisan, a Teton Sioux chief who controlled this stretch of the Missouri River like a medieval lord controlled his bridge, and who had just grabbed the rope of Clark's boat and declared that no white man would pass without paying tribute. Two worlds were about to collide on this muddy riverbank. The expanding American Republic and the sovereign nations of the Great Plains and only one would emerge unchanged. What happened next would echo across a continent and determine the fate of dozens of Native American nations who had never heard the name Thomas Jefferson. The primary account of this confrontation comes from the expedition journals of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark themselves, two captains who kept meticulous daily records throughout their 8,000-mile journey to the Pacific Ocean and back. Their writings, preserved in multiple copies and supplemented by the journals of Sergeant John Ordway and Private Joseph Whitehouse, provide an unprecedented window into one of the most consequential expeditions in human history. These men stood at the center of every crisis, negotiated with chiefs whose names would fade from memory, and witnessed the collision between civilizations that would reshape the North American continent forever. But the story of Lewis and Clark begins not with that tense standoff on the Missouri, but in the mind of a president who dreamed of an empire stretching from sea to shining sea. Thomas Jefferson had been obsessed with the American West since boyhood. As a young man, he had instructed his personal secretary, a brilliant, moody Army captain named Meriwether Lewis, to prepare for a journey that would cross the continent and find the Northwest Passage, that mythical all-water route to the Pacific that would make America the dominant trading power in the world. Jefferson believed such a passage existed. Every educated man in America believed it. They were all catastrophically wrong, but their beautiful delusion would drive one of the greatest adventures in human history. In 1803, that delusion suddenly became urgent reality. Napoleon Bonaparte, strapped for cash and losing interest in his American empire, had just sold Jefferson 828,000 square miles of territory stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains for $15 million. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the United States overnight, but it presented Jefferson with an extraordinary problem. He had just bought a blank space on the map. No American had ever crossed it. No one knew what lived there, what grew there, or whether hostile nations might be building armies in its vast interior. Jefferson needed someone to find out what he had purchased. More than that, he needed someone to claim it, to plant the American flag so deep in that wilderness that neither Britain nor Spain could ever pull it out. He chose Meriwether Lewis, the 29-year-old Army captain who had served as his personal secretary for 2 years. It was an audacious choice. Lewis was undoubtedly brilliant, fluent in Latin, trained in botany and medicine, a natural leader who could march 30 miles through mountain snow without complaint. But he was also volatile, subject to what Jefferson later called sensible depressions of mind, and he had never commanded anything larger than a frontier garrison. Jefferson was asking him to lead an expedition across unknown terrain inhabited by unknown peoples, to survive off the land for 2 years, and to return with maps and specimens that would justify the greatest real estate deal in human history. Lewis's response revealed the quality that would carry him across a continent. He said yes immediately, then spent the winter of 1803 learning everything he would need to survive. Jefferson personally tutored him in botany, zoology, and celestial navigation. The American Philosophical Society taught him to preserve specimens. Dr. Benjamin Rush, the nation's most prominent physician, trained him in frontier medicine and provided him with a medical kit that included 60 dozen of Rush's bilious pills, a mercury-based laxative so powerful the expedition would later call them thunderclappers. But Lewis's most important decision came not from Jefferson's guidance, but from his own understanding of his limitations. In February 1803, he wrote a letter to his old Army friend William Clark, inviting him to co-command the expedition. The letter revealed both Lewis's strategic mind and his emotional needs. If therefore there is anything under those circumstances in this enterprise which would induce you to participate with me in its fatigues, its dangers, and its honors, believe me, there is no man on earth with whom I should feel equal pleasure in sharing them. Lewis understood instinctively that he needed a partner who possessed everything he lacked. Where Lewis was introspective and scientific, Clark was practical and decisive. Where Lewis could identify a new species of plant, Clark could keep 30 men fed, armed, and moving forward through terrain that had never appeared on any map. Where Lewis might spend an hour crafting the perfect sentence to describe a waterfall, Clark would already be calculating the portage route around it. William Clark was everything Lewis was not, and everything the expedition would require to survive. Born in Virginia but raised on the Kentucky frontier, he was a natural outdoorsman who had spent his adult life fighting Indian wars in the Ohio Territory. He possessed an almost mystical gift for map-making. His hand-drawn charts of the Missouri River would remain the standard reference for 50 years. He was steady where Lewis was mercurial, warm where Lewis was reserved, diplomatic where Lewis could be imperious. Most importantly, he commanded instant respect from both officers and enlisted men through a combination of competence and genuine concern for their welfare that military manuals cannot teach. Clark accepted Lewis's invitation within 2 weeks, though his response revealed the practical mind that would prove so essential. He immediately began recruiting men, purchasing supplies, and asking the specific questions about routes and objectives that Lewis, in his excitement, had not yet considered. Together, they made one of the most effective partnerships in the history of exploration. They shared command equally, a virtually unprecedented arrangement in the military hierarchy of 1803 and apparently never had a serious disagreement during the 28 months they spent together in the wilderness. Each man's strengths compensated for the other's weaknesses so completely that their combined capability far exceeded what either could have accomplished alone. But Clark brought more than competence to the expedition. He brought York, his enslaved manservant, whose presence would add a layer of moral complexity to every mile of the journey. York was a powerfully built man in his mid-30s who had been enslaved by the Clark family since childhood. He had grown up alongside William Clark, serving as playmate, companion, and ultimately personal servant to his owner. York was a skilled hunter, an excellent swimmer, and possessed the kind of quick intelligence that would prove invaluable in countless situations throughout the expedition. But he was also property, a human being owned by another human being whose participation in one of America's greatest adventures would highlight the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the young republic. Native American tribes would be astonished by York's dark skin. Some would believe he possessed spiritual powers, rubbing wet fingers against his skin to see if the color would come off. York would participate fully in the expedition's daily life, hunting, standing guard duty, even voting on crucial decisions about where to establish winter quarters. Yet when the expedition returned to civilization, Clark would refuse York's request for freedom, viewing his desire for independence as ingratitude rather than the natural human aspiration it represented. Through the winter of 1803 to 1804, Lewis and Clark assembled their team at Camp Dubois, a temporary base near St. Louis, where the Mississippi and Missouri rivers converge in a muddy embrace. They called their group the Corps of Discovery, a name that captured both their military organization and their scientific mission. The men they recruited were a rough collection of soldiers, frontiersmen, and civilians, many of them hard-drinking, brawling troublemakers who had to be beaten into discipline through courts-martial and brutal punishments. But scattered among the misfits were men of extraordinary capability. George Drouillard, half French-Canadian and half Shawnee, was the finest hunter and tracker on the American frontier, capable of communicating through sign language with tribes whose spoken languages no white man had ever heard. Sergeant Charles Floyd, barely 21 years old, possessed the kind of steady courage and natural leadership that made older men follow his example without question. Patrick Gass, a Pennsylvania carpenter, could build anything from a fort to a canoe using only the tools he carried in his pack. The expedition also had a remarkable non-human member, Seaman, a Newfoundland dog that Lewis purchased for $20, roughly $500 in today's currency. The dog weighed over 100 pounds, could retrieve waterfowl from the roughest currents, and possessed the keen senses that would warn the expedition of approaching grizzly bears on countless nights, when such warning meant the difference between sleep and death. On May 14, 1804, Clark led the expedition north from Camp Dubois in 3 boats, a 55-foot keelboat that carried 10 tons of supplies and equipment, and 2 smaller pirogues that could be paddled or sailed depending on wind conditions. Lewis joined the expedition 6 days later at St. Charles, Missouri, where he completed final preparations and said goodbye to civilization. By May 25th, they passed La Charrette, a tiny French settlement that represented the last outpost of European civilization on the Missouri River. From this point forward, they were entering territory that existed on no reliable map, inhabited by peoples whose languages they did not speak, whose political structures they did not understand, and whose intentions toward American explorers remained utterly unknown. The work was immediately brutal. The Missouri River in 1804 was not the channelized waterway that modern travelers know, but a wild, constantly shifting torrent that carried entire trees in its current and changed course with every spring flood. The men had to pole, push, pull, and drag their 10-ton keelboat against the relentless current, covering only 10 to 15 miles on a good day. When the wind favored them, they could raise a sail and make 20 miles. When it opposed them, they might advance only 5 miles despite 12 hours of backbreaking labor. The physical demands were crushing. The men rose at dawn, loaded the boats, and spent the entire day in the water or on the muddy banks, fighting the river's current with every step. The summer heat was oppressive, often reaching well over 100 degrees, and they were savaged by mosquitoes and ticks in numbers that defied imagination. Lewis wrote that the mosquitoes were so thick they appeared like columns of smoke rising from the marshes, and that the men's faces were swollen beyond recognition from the constant biting. But the physical hardships were nothing compared to the psychological challenge of traveling through a landscape that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. These men came from the eastern United States, where forests and mountains provided natural boundaries and reference points. The Great Plains offered no such comfort. The horizon extended unbroken for dozens of miles in every direction, and the sameness of the landscape created a kind of vertigo that Lewis struggled to describe in his journals. "The whole face of the country," he wrote, "was one continued plain as far as the eye can reach, in which no tree, shrub, or vegetation of any kind exists, except on the borders of the watercourses. Yet this apparent emptiness teemed with life in forms and numbers that astonished the expedition members. The buffalo herds were so vast they darkened the plains for miles in every direction. Lewis estimated that a single herd contained over 3,000 animals, and noted that they had passed dozens of such herds. The elk were equally numerous, and so unafraid of humans that they could be approached to within 20 yards before showing any alarm. The expedition encountered animals that no American naturalist had ever described. Prairie dogs lived in vast underground cities that covered hundreds of acres. Pronghorn antelope could run faster than the expedition's horses and seemed to dance across the landscape with supernatural grace. But it was the grizzly bears that captured the expedition's attention and gradually filled them with a fear unlike anything they had experienced in the eastern wilderness. The Mandan and Hidatsa tribes had warned Lewis and Clark about the white bear, enormous creatures that hunted alone, feared nothing, and could kill a man with a single blow from their massive paws. The tribal hunters spoke of grizzlies with the same reverence they reserved for enemy war parties, explaining that they hunted bears only in groups of 8 to 10 men wearing war paint, and accepting that even then a bear might kill one of the hunters. Lewis initially dismissed these warnings as superstition. His men were skilled marksmen armed with the finest rifles available, and Lewis was confident they could handle any animal the wilderness might produce. His confidence would prove to be one of the expedition's most dangerous miscalculations. The first grizzly encounter occurred in late April 1805, when 2 expedition members shot a young bear that still required multiple bullets before it died. Lewis noted in his journal that the bear was surprisingly tenacious, but remained convinced that proper marksmanship would solve any future problems. He could not have imagined that the expedition's journals would eventually document over 100 separate grizzly encounters, many of them near-fatal disasters that left grown men trembling and sleepless. But before the grizzlies nearly destroyed them, and before they faced starvation in the mountains, and before Sacagawea reunited with the brother she had been torn from as a child, the Corps of Discovery had to survive their first major test of diplomacy and courage. They had to face the Teton Sioux, the most powerful military force on the northern Great Plains, and convince them to allow 33 Americans to pass through territory that the Sioux had controlled for generations. The confrontation began on September 25th, 1804, near present-day Pierre, South Dakota, when 3 Teton Sioux chiefs, Black Buffalo, the Partisan, and Buffalo Medicine, came aboard the expedition's keelboat for a formal council. Lewis and Clark had been instructed by President Jefferson to announce American sovereignty over Louisiana and to distribute peace medals and gifts as symbols of the new relationship between the United States and the Western tribes. But the Teton Sioux had no interest in American sovereignty. They controlled the Missouri River trade through a combination of military power and strategic positioning, extracting tribute from every trading expedition that passed through their territory. They had grown wealthy and powerful by serving as middlemen between the agricultural tribes upstream and the trading posts downstream. And they viewed the Lewis and Clark expedition not as explorers but as competitors who might disrupt their profitable monopoly. The council quickly turned tense. The Partisan, a war chief whose reputation extended across the northern plains, made it clear that the Americans would not pass without paying substantial tribute. When Lewis and Clark refused, offering only token gifts, the Partisan grabbed the rope of Clark's boat and called for his warriors. Within minutes, 200 Sioux warriors appeared on the riverbank, their faces painted for war, their bows strung and arrows nocked. Clark drew his sword. Lewis ordered the expedition's swivel guns loaded with grape shot, small metal balls that would tear through human bodies like bullets through paper. The Americans cocked their rifles and took positions behind the boat's gunwales, while Seaman, Lewis's Newfoundland dog, began barking with the agitation that animals display when they sense impending violence. For 30 minutes, that felt like hours. The two forces stared at each other across 20 yards of muddy water. The Sioux possessed overwhelming numerical superiority and were fighting to defend territory they had controlled for generations. The Americans possessed superior firepower but were hopelessly outnumbered and hundreds of miles from any possible reinforcement. The confrontation balanced on a knife's edge. A single nervous movement, a misunderstood gesture, an accidental discharge of a weapon, and the greatest expedition in American history would have ended in a massacre that left no survivors to tell the tale. Thomas Jefferson would have waited in vain for reports that never came. The maps of the Western territories would have remained blank for another generation. The fate of the Oregon Territory might have fallen to British rather than American claims. What broke the standoff was not superior American diplomacy or Sioux generosity, but the sobering recognition by both sides that the cost of violence would exceed any possible gain. Black Buffalo, the senior Sioux chief, understood that while his warriors might destroy the American expedition, the consequences of such destruction would eventually bring a much larger military response. Clark understood that his expedition's mission was exploration, not conquest, and that dead explorers accomplished nothing. The tension dissolved gradually, almost imperceptibly, as Black Buffalo stepped forward and made a gesture that allowed both sides to retreat from the brink of violence without losing face. He invited the Americans to shore for a feast, transforming a potential battle into a diplomatic ceremony that satisfied Sioux requirements for respect while allowing the expedition to continue its journey. But the encounter left both Lewis and Clark shaken by how quickly exploration could become warfare and how completely their mission's success depended on the goodwill of peoples whose motives they barely understood. They had learned that Jefferson's instructions to announce American sovereignty were meaningless without the military power to enforce such sovereignty, and that the Western territories were not empty wilderness waiting to be claimed, but homelands defended by nations who would not surrender them without a fight. The core of discovery continued up the Missouri River into the heart of the continent, but the Sioux confrontation had changed them. They now traveled with constant awareness that they were not merely exploring unknown territory, but moving through the borderlands between worlds, between the expanding American Republic and the sovereign nations of the Great Plains, between the age of exploration and the age of conquest, between the dream of peaceful coexistence and the reality of inevitable conflict. As autumn arrived and the first cold winds began blowing down from the northern plains, the expedition pushed deeper into territory that no American had ever seen, carrying with them the seeds of changes that would transform the continent forever. Behind them lay the familiar world of St. Louis and Washington, D.C., where politicians debated the future of the West in comfortable ignorance of its reality. Ahead lay the Mandan villages, where they would spend their first winter in the wilderness and meet the remarkable young woman whose knowledge would make the difference between success and disaster. But first they had to survive the northern plains, where the buffalo herds were giving way to emptier landscapes, where the Arikara and Mandan peoples controlled the river trade, and where every day's journey carried them further from any possibility of rescue or retreat. The expedition that had begun as Thomas Jefferson's dream of scientific discovery was becoming something far more complex and dangerous, a collision between worlds that would echo across generations and reshape the destiny of a continent. The expedition reached the Arikara villages in early October, entering a world that defied every assumption they had carried from the civilized East. The Arikara were not the wandering nomads that American politicians imagined when they spoke of Indian tribes, but sophisticated agriculturalists who lived in permanent earth lodge villages that housed over 3,000 people. Their settlements stretched along the Missouri River for miles, surrounded by vast fields of corn, beans, and squash that fed not only the Arikara themselves, but the nomadic hunting tribes who came to trade buffalo meat and horses for agricultural surplus. Lewis and Clark found themselves in the middle of a complex economic and political network that spanned half the continent. Arikara traders traveled as far south as New Mexico to exchange goods with Spanish merchants, and as far north as the Canadian border to trade with French voyageurs. The villages served as neutral ground where traditional enemies could meet safely to exchange goods, and the Arikara chiefs maintained their prosperity by carefully balancing the competing interests of dozens of different tribes and trading companies. But the expedition's arrival coincided with a period of crisis that threatened to destroy this delicate balance. A devastating smallpox epidemic had swept through the Arikara villages just 2 years earlier, killing nearly half the population and leaving the survivors struggling to maintain their traditional role as middlemen in the river trade. Sioux war parties were pressing in from the east, taking advantage of Arikara weakness to extract tribute and seize territory. Spanish traders from St. Louis were demanding exclusive trading rights that would cut off the Arikara's traditional connections to French and British merchants. The Arikara chief, a dignified man named Kakawisasa, welcomed Lewis and Clark with the elaborate ceremonies due to important visitors, but his questions revealed the underlying tensions that threatened his people's survival. He wanted to know whether the Americans would protect the Arikara from Sioux aggression. He asked if American traders would pay fair prices for Arikara corn and horses. Most importantly, he inquired whether American promises of peace and prosperity were more reliable than Spanish promises, French promises, and British promises, all of which had been broken when circumstances changed. Lewis and Clark found themselves unable to provide the assurances that Kakawisasa sought. They could promise American friendship, but not American military protection. They could speak of future trading opportunities, but could not guarantee prices or exclusive relationships. They were explorers and diplomats, not generals or merchants, and their mission was to gather information rather than make binding commitments on behalf of the United States government. The limitation frustrated both sides. The Arikara needed concrete guarantees to justify shifting their allegiances from established trading partners to an unknown American republic. Lewis and Clark needed Arikara cooperation to continue their journey safely, but they lacked the authority to offer anything more substantial than friendship and vague promises of future benefits. The negotiations stretched over 4 days, conducted in a mixture of English, French, and sign language that created constant opportunities for misunderstanding. Lewis's scientific mind was fascinated by Arikara agricultural techniques and their sophisticated understanding of plant breeding. Clark's practical intelligence focused on gathering information about the river route ahead and the political relationships between tribes, but both men struggled to bridge the gap between Arikara expectations and American limitations. The breakthrough came not through diplomatic skill, but through a demonstration of American technology that captured Arikara imagination. Lewis had brought with him an air gun, a pneumatic rifle that could fire bullets without gunpowder or visible flame. To Arikara eyes, it appeared to be a weapon that drew its power from the spirit world rather than from earthly materials. Lewis's demonstration of the airgun created the kind of wonder that transcends cultural boundaries. Warriors who had faced Spanish muskets and British trade guns without fear watched in amazement as Lewis fired bullet after bullet without reloading powder or shot. Children gathered around the weapon as if it were a sacred object. Even Keikawisasa, who had maintained dignified composure throughout the diplomatic discussions, could not hide his fascination with the mysterious gun. The demonstration accomplished what hours of political negotiation had failed to achieve. It established Lewis and Clark as men who possessed power that transcended ordinary understanding, marking them as figures worthy of respect and careful treatment. The Arikara agreed to provide guides and information for the next stage of the journey, not because they trusted American promises, but because they recognized American capabilities. But the expedition's departure from the Arikara villages brought them face to face with a challenge that no amount of diplomatic skill or technological superiority could solve: winter on the northern Great Plains. October temperatures were already dropping below freezing at night, and the expedition was still more than 1,500 miles from the Pacific Ocean. Lewis and Clark faced a choice that would determine whether their men lived or died over the next 6 months. They could push forward, hoping to cover more ground before winter made travel impossible, or they could find a place to establish winter quarters and wait for spring. The decision was made for them by geography and weather. By late October, ice was forming along the edges of the Missouri River, and the expedition's boats were struggling against increasingly frequent snowstorms that reduced visibility to a few yards and made navigation treacherous. The men were suffering from exposure despite their heavy clothing, and several were showing signs of illness that would become dangerous if left untreated in brutal winter conditions. On October 26, 1804, the expedition reached the Mandan and Hidatsa villages near present-day Bismarck, North Dakota, where over 4,000 people lived in 5 permanent settlements that represented the northernmost extension of agricultural civilization on the Great Plains. Lewis and Clark immediately recognized that they had found their winter sanctuary. The Mandan and Hidatsa peoples occupied a unique position in the geography and politics of the northern plains. Their villages stood at the convergence of 2 different worlds: the agricultural societies of the river valleys and the nomadic hunting cultures of the grasslands. Mandan farmers grew corn, beans, squash, and sunflowers in fields that stretched for miles along the river bottoms. Hidatsa hunters ranged far out onto the plains, following buffalo herds and trading with nomadic tribes whose names were unknown to European geographers. But it was the village's role as a trading center that made them indispensable to the expedition's survival. French and British traders had been visiting the Mandan villages for over 50 years, establishing relationships that brought European manufactured goods in exchange for furs, horses, and agricultural products. The villages served as neutral ground where Assiniboine warriors from the north could trade peacefully with Crow hunters from the south, where Cheyenne horse traders could negotiate safely with Arikara farmers. Lewis and Clark found themselves welcomed not as strangers, but as the newest participants in a commercial and diplomatic network that spanned the North American continent. Mandan chiefs like Black Cat and Big White possessed sophisticated understanding of European politics and economics. They could discuss the implications of the Louisiana Purchase, with the same expertise they brought to analyzing the seasonal movements of buffalo herds or the military capabilities of rival tribes. The expedition established Fort Mandan on the north bank of the Missouri River, just downstream from the main Mandan village. The fort was a triangular stockade with log cabins for the men, storage rooms for supplies and specimens, and workshops where the expedition's blacksmith could repair equipment and trade iron tools for Indian corn and meat. The location provided security from winter storms while keeping the expedition close enough to the villages to maintain daily contact with their hosts. It was at Fort Mandan that Lewis and Clark encountered the two individuals who would prove most crucial to their expedition's ultimate success: Toussaint Charbonneau and his teenage wife, Sacagawea. Charbonneau was a French-Canadian voyageur in his mid-40s who had lived among the Mandan and Hidatsa peoples for several years, working as an interpreter and trader. He was a rough, unreliable man who drank too much, boasted too often, and possessed the kind of casual arrogance that made him few friends among either Indians or whites. But he spoke several tribal languages and knew the geography of the upper Missouri River country from years of trading expeditions. Lewis and Clark hired Charbonneau as an interpreter, but their real interest lay in his young wife, a Shoshone woman who had been captured by Hidatsa raiders 5 years earlier and sold to Charbonneau as a slave and concubine. Sacagawea was perhaps 16 years old, pregnant with her first child, and possessed knowledge that would prove invaluable to the expedition's success. The Shoshone people lived in the Rocky Mountain region where the Missouri River had its headwaters, exactly where Lewis and Clark would need to obtain horses for the mountain crossing that represented the most dangerous phase of their entire journey. Sacagawea could speak Shoshone, identify edible plants, and navigate terrain that no member of the expedition had ever seen. More importantly, her presence would signal to any tribe they encountered that the expedition was not a war party, since no war party would travel with a woman and infant. But Sacagawea was more than a valuable asset. She was a human being whose own story intersected with the expedition's journey in ways that would reveal the complex moral landscape of American expansion. She had been torn from her family as an 11-year-old girl, sold into slavery, and forced into a marriage with a man twice her age who treated her as property rather than as a person. Her participation in the expedition would reunite her with the brother she had been separated from as a child, but it would also carry her further from the homeland she had never stopped dreaming of returning to. The moral complexity of Sacagawea's situation troubled Lewis and Clark less than it should have, but it reflected the broader contradictions that ran through their entire mission. They were exploring territory in the name of a republic founded on principles of human equality, while traveling with an enslaved African American and an enslaved Indian woman. They were gathering scientific specimens and diplomatic intelligence that would facilitate American expansion into lands inhabited by sovereign peoples who had never consented to such expansion. They were creating maps that would guide future settlers who would displace the very peoples who were helping them survive. These contradictions would become more apparent as the expedition continued, but during the winter at Fort Mandan, they were obscured by the immediate challenges of survival and the genuine friendships that developed between expedition members and their Indian hosts. The winter of 1804 to 1805 was brutally cold, with temperatures dropping as low as 40 degrees below zero and blizzards that lasted for days at a time. Without the constant supply of food, fuel, and shelter provided by the Mandan and Hidatsa villages, the entire expedition would have frozen to death or starved before Christmas. The men spent the winter months repairing equipment, preserving specimens, and preparing for the journey ahead. Lewis conducted scientific observations, measuring temperatures, recording weather patterns, and cataloging the plants and animals they had encountered during their first season in the wilderness. Clark worked on his maps, incorporating information gathered from Indian sources about the geography of the regions they would traverse during the coming year. But the winter also provided time for reflection that revealed how profoundly the expedition was being changed by its experiences. The men who had left St. Louis 8 months earlier as representatives of American civilization were becoming something different. Hybrid figures who belonged fully neither to the world they had left behind nor to the world they were discovering. They were learning to read weather signs that no European meteorologist had ever studied. They were acquiring survival skills that no military manual had ever described. They were developing relationships with peoples whose existence had been unknown to Thomas Jefferson when he planned their mission. Most importantly, they were beginning to understand that the Western territories were not empty wilderness waiting to be claimed, but complex human landscapes where dozens of sovereign peoples had been living, fighting, trading, and creating civilizations for thousands of years. The psychological transformation was most evident in Lewis, whose scientific curiosity was gradually being overwhelmed by the emotional weight of what he was witnessing. His journal entries from the winter at Fort Mandan reveal a man struggling to reconcile his role as an agent of American expansion with his growing understanding of what that expansion would cost the peoples who were helping him survive. Clark's transformation was more practical, but equally profound. His natural diplomatic skills were being refined through daily interaction with peoples whose political structures were more sophisticated than anything he had encountered on the Kentucky frontier. He was learning that effective leadership in the wilderness required not just military discipline, but cultural sensitivity, emotional intelligence, and the kind of humble respect for local knowledge that his Virginia upbringing had never taught him. The expedition's enlisted men were also being changed by their experiences in ways that would affect them for the rest of their lives. They were learning that survival in unknown territory required abandoning many of the assumptions about racial and cultural superiority that they had carried from the settlements. The Indian peoples who surrounded Fort Mandan were not the savage enemies described in frontier newspapers, but complex human beings whose knowledge, skills, and generosity made the difference between life and death. George Drouillard, the expedition's half-Shawnee hunter, served as a bridge between these worlds, translating not just languages, but entire ways of understanding the relationship between humans and the natural environment. His ability to track animals across vast distances, to predict weather patterns from subtle atmospheric changes, and to navigate by landmarks that were invisible to untrained eyes, demonstrated forms of intelligence that no European university had ever recognized or valued. York's position within the expedition was also evolving in ways that complicated the simple categories of master and slave. His skills as a hunter and his strength in emergency situations made him an invaluable member of the team. Indian peoples who had never seen a person of African descent treated him with curiosity and respect, asking him to participate in ceremonies and negotiations as an equal. Yet he remained Clark's property, owned by a man who could sell him or punish him at will, despite York's crucial contributions to the expedition's survival. The winter months also brought the expedition face to face with the biological realities of their mission in the most personal possible way. On February 11th, 1805, Sacagawea went into labor with her first child, beginning a difficult delivery that threatened both her life and the life of her infant. The birth took place in the cramped quarters of Fort Mandan, with Lewis serving as midwife despite having no training in obstetrics beyond the medical instruction he had received from Dr. Rush in Philadelphia. The labor lasted for hours, with Sacagawea suffering complications that left Lewis genuinely afraid that both mother and child would die. His journal entry from that night reveals the anxiety of a man who understood that Sacagawea's death would eliminate the expedition's best hope of obtaining horses from the Shoshone peoples. But the crisis also revealed Lewis's capacity for compassion that transcended his utilitarian concerns about the expedition's success. He sat with Sacagawea through the long night of her labor, offering what comfort he could to a teenage girl who was suffering in a language he could not speak, among people who were not her own, in circumstances that she had not chosen. The child, a son whom Charbonneau named Jean-Baptiste but whom Clark would always call Pomp, was born healthy despite the complications of delivery. His birth added a new dimension to the expedition's already complex dynamics. They were no longer just a military unit exploring unknown territory, but a makeshift family that included an infant whose needs would have to be considered in every decision about route, timing, and risk. The presence of a 2-month-old baby would transform the expedition in ways that no amount of planning could have anticipated. Sacagawea would carry her son through mountain passes where grown men struggled to breathe, across rivers where the current could sweep away a horse and rider, through territories where hostile war parties might attack without warning. The infant's survival would depend not just on his mother's devotion, but on the protection and assistance of 33 men who had signed up to explore the wilderness, not to serve as guards for a baby. Yet Pomp's presence would also provide the expedition with its most powerful diplomatic credential. No war party travels with a nursing mother and infant. No slave-raiding expedition brings along a woman and child who would slow their movements and compromise their ability to fight. Sacagawea and her son would serve as a living declaration that the core of discovery came in peace, seeking passage rather than conquest. As winter gradually loosened its grip on the northern plains, Lewis and Clark began preparing for the next phase of their journey. They sent the expedition's keelboat back to St. Louis in April 1805, loaded with maps, specimens, and reports for President Jefferson. The boat carried cages containing live prairie dogs, boxes of pressed plants, Indian artifacts, and Clark's detailed charts of the Missouri River from St. Louis to the Mandan villages. But the boat also carried something more significant than scientific specimens: proof that the expedition had survived its first year in the wilderness and was continuing toward objectives that had seemed impossible when they departed from St. Louis. Jefferson would receive confirmation that his vision of continental exploration was achievable, that the Western territories contained resources and opportunities that justified the Louisiana Purchase, and that American explorers could establish peaceful relationships with the Western tribes. The smaller party that continued west from Fort Mandan on April 7, 1805, was profoundly different from the expedition that had departed St. Louis 11 months earlier. Lewis and Clark had selected their most reliable men for the mountain crossing, creating a core team of 28 soldiers and civilians plus Sacagawea, her infant son, and Charbonneau. They traveled in 2 pirogues and 6 canoes, carrying supplies that would have to last them until they reached the Pacific Ocean or found other sources of food and equipment. They were also carrying expectations and responsibilities that weighed heavier than any physical cargo. The success or failure of Thomas Jefferson's vision of continental empire now depended on the decisions that 33 people would make in territories that no American had ever seen. The maps they created would guide future generations of settlers. The relationships they established would influence American Indian policy for decades. The specimens they collected would advance scientific understanding of the continent's biological diversity. But they were also carrying the personal dreams and fears of individuals whose lives had become intertwined with the expedition's fate. Lewis sought redemption for the restlessness that had always driven him away from settled society. Clark hoped to prove himself worthy of the trust that Jefferson and Lewis had placed in him. Sacagawea carried the possibility of reunion with the family she had been torn from as a child. York dreamed of freedom that his essential contributions to the expedition might eventually earn. As they paddled away from Fort Mandan into the unknown waters of the upper Missouri River, none of them could imagine the ordeals that lay ahead. They could not foresee the grizzly bear encounters that would leave grown men trembling with terror. They could not anticipate the waterfalls that would force them to carry their boats across 18 miles of rugged terrain. They could not predict the mountain passes where they would nearly starve to death, or the moments of transcendent beauty when they would witness landscapes that no words could adequately describe. What they carried instead was the kind of hope that sustains people through impossible circumstances. The belief that human courage and determination could overcome any obstacle that geography or weather might place in their path. They had survived winter on the northern plains. They had established friendships with peoples whose names appeared on no American map. They had proven to themselves and to each other that they possessed the skills and resilience necessary for continental exploration. The Missouri River above Fort Mandan flowed through country that was wilder and more dangerous than anything they had yet encountered, but it also carried them toward discoveries that would justify every hardship they had endured and every risk they would face. Behind them lay the familiar world of American settlements and European trade routes. Ahead lay the backbone of the continent, where the waters divided between east and west, and where a young Shoshone woman would meet the brother she had never stopped hoping to see again. The upper Missouri revealed itself as a river transformed. Gone were the muddy, familiar waters that had carried them past the settlements of Missouri and the trading posts of the lower plains. Here the water ran clearer, colder, flowing down from mountain sources that no American had ever seen. The current was swifter, more treacherous, broken by rapids that appeared without warning and hidden rocks that could crush a canoe in seconds. Lewis stood in the bow of the lead pirogue, studying the water ahead with the intensity of a man whose life depended on reading every ripple and shadow. Behind him, the expedition stretched out in single file, 6 canoes and 2 pirogues carrying everything they would need to cross half a continent. There was no margin for error now. They were beyond the reach of any rescue, beyond the possibility of resupply, beyond the comfort of knowing that other white men had traveled this route before them and survived. The landscape around them was changing as dramatically as the river itself. The endless grasslands that had dominated their journey from St. Louis were giving way to broken country, rolling hills carved by countless streams, punctuated by strange rock formations that rose from the earth like ancient monuments. Lewis's trained eye cataloged new species of plants and animals with every mile, but his scientific excitement was tempered by growing awareness of the challenges ahead. The expedition was now traveling through the domain of the grizzly bear, and every member of the Corps had heard enough Mandan and Hidatsa stories to understand that they were entering territory controlled by predators unlike anything in their previous experience. The tribal hunters had described bears that stood 8 feet tall on their hind legs, weighed as much as 3 men, and possessed claws longer than a man's fingers. More disturbing were the accounts of grizzly intelligence, bears that could track humans for miles, that seemed to understand the danger of firearms and develop strategies to avoid or overcome them. Lewis had initially dismissed these stories as the natural exaggeration that surrounded any unfamiliar danger. But his confidence began to erode on April 29, 1805, when the expedition encountered their first adult grizzly. 2 of his best hunters, both men who had killed dozens of black bears in the eastern forests, approached what they thought was a dead bear lying on a sandbar. The animal exploded into motion when they drew within 20 feet, rising to its full height and charging with a roar that Lewis later described as the most tremendous roaring I ever heard. Both men fired simultaneously, their .54 caliber rifles driving lead balls deep into the bear's chest. The grizzly absorbed the impact without slowing, continuing its charge as if the bullets were bee stings. Only a desperate dive into the river saved the hunters from claws that could have decapitated a horse. The bear pursued them into the water, swimming with surprising grace and speed, forcing both men to remain submerged until the animal finally lost interest and returned to shore. The incident shattered every assumption the expedition had made about their ability to handle Western wildlife. These were experienced frontiersmen armed with the finest weapons available, yet they had barely escaped death from a single animal. Lewis's journal entry that night reveals a man coming to terms with his own vulnerability. I find that the curiosity of our party is pretty well satisfied with respect to this animal. The men, as well as myself, are anxious to meet with some other of these bears. But the Grizzlies were far from finished with the Corps of Discovery. Over the next 6 weeks, bear encounters became a regular feature of expedition life, each one teaching harsh lessons about the inadequacy of Eastern assumptions when applied to Western realities. The bears seemed almost supernaturally difficult to kill, absorbing multiple rifle balls and continuing to fight with undiminished fury. Worse, they appeared to learn from each encounter, developing what could only be described as tactical awareness of human weaknesses. One particularly terrifying incident occurred when 6 expedition members encountered a grizzly on an open plain where no trees or rocks offered refuge. All 6 men fired simultaneously, hitting the bear with multiple shots that would have killed any other animal instantly. The grizzly charged directly at the nearest hunter, who threw down his rifle and ran, The bear pursued him for nearly 2 miles across the prairie while the other hunters desperately tried to reload and catch up. Only when the exhausted animal finally collapsed from blood loss did the pursuit end, leaving the entire party shaken by their narrow escape. Lewis began to understand why the Mandan and Hidatsa warriors spoke of grizzly hunting with the same reverence they reserved for warfare. These bears were not simply large animals, but intelligent adversaries that required the same careful planning and group coordination that tribal warriors used against enemy war parties. The expedition adapted their procedures accordingly, posting guards whenever they camped in grizzly country and requiring that no man travel alone under any circumstances. But if the Grizzlies tested the expedition's courage, the Missouri River itself tested their endurance and skill. The current above Fort Mandan was significantly stronger than anything they had encountered downstream, and the river's course wound through increasingly challenging terrain. Progress slowed to a crawl as the men spent entire days dragging their boats through shallow rapids or portaging around obstacles that blocked the channel completely. The physical demands were crushing. The men rose before dawn and worked until darkness, their hands raw from rope burns, their feet constantly soaked from wading in the cold mountain water. The river bottom was treacherous, covered with sharp stones that cut through moccasins and slick rocks that sent heavily loaded men sprawling into the current. Yet they pressed forward with the stubborn determination that had carried them through winter on the northern plains. Sacagawea proved invaluable during this phase of the journey, not merely as a guide and interpreter, but as a practical problem solver whose knowledge of plant foods and navigation techniques repeatedly saved the expedition from disaster. She could identify edible roots and berries that supplemented their dwindling food supplies, locate fresh water sources in apparently barren country, and read landscape features that revealed the safest routes through difficult terrain. More importantly, her presence continued to serve as a diplomatic passport that opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. When the expedition encountered small bands of Indian hunters, Sacagawea's ability to communicate in sign language and her status as a woman traveling with a child immediately established peaceful intentions. These chance meetings provided crucial information about the geography ahead and sometimes resulted in trades that replenished the expedition's supplies. But it was Sacagawea's role as a mother that most impressed the expedition members and revealed the extraordinary nature of what she was accomplishing. She carried her infant son through rapids where grown men struggled to keep their footing, nursed him in camps where grizzly bears prowled the perimeter, and maintained her responsibilities as guide and interpreter while managing the constant demands of caring for a baby in the wilderness. Lewis and Clark watched this daily demonstration of maternal devotion and practical competence with growing respect that transcended their utilitarian interest in Sacagawea's usefulness to the mission. Clark in particular developed a paternal affection for little John Baptiste, whom he called "my boy Pomp," and began making plans to provide for the child's education when the expedition returned to civilization. Yet the expedition's growing appreciation for Sacagawea's contributions only highlighted the moral contradictions that surrounded her participation. She was simultaneously one of the most valuable members of the Corps and one of the most powerless, contributing essential skills while remaining the property of a man who treated her more like a servant than a partner. Her knowledge was saving American lives and advancing American interests, yet she would receive no recognition or reward for her service beyond whatever protection the expedition could provide during their time together. These contradictions became more apparent as the expedition pushed deeper into territories where Sacagawea's geographical knowledge became increasingly specific and personal. She began recognizing landmarks from her childhood, pointing out familiar rock formations and describing campsites where her people had stayed during their seasonal movements. Her excitement at these recognitions was palpable, but it was tempered by uncertainty about what she might find when they finally reached Shoshone country. 5 years had passed since Hidatsa raiders had captured her near the Three Forks of the Missouri River. Her family might have moved to different hunting grounds. Her people might have been scattered by warfare or disease. The brother she remembered as a boy her own age would now be a man, possibly a war chief with responsibilities that outweighed childhood bonds. there was no guarantee that her knowledge of Shoshone country would prove current, or that her family connections would secure the horses that the expedition desperately needed for their mountain crossing. These uncertainties weighed heavily on Lewis and Clark as they approached the most critical phase of their entire journey. Every piece of information they had gathered about Western geography pointed to the same inescapable conclusion. The Rocky Mountains could not be crossed by water. Somewhere ahead, the Missouri River would divide into smaller streams that eventually became too shallow and swift for navigation. At that point, the expedition would have to abandon their boats and continue on foot, carrying their supplies across mountain passes that might be blocked by snow even in midsummer. The success of this transition would depend entirely on their ability to obtain horses from the Shoshone people, and their ability to obtain horses would depend largely on Sacagawea's capacity to establish relationships with her own people after 5 years of separation. The weight of continental exploration had come to rest on the shoulders of a teenage girl who was simultaneously one of the expedition's most essential members and one of its most vulnerable. As May turned to June, the expedition encountered the first of the geographical obstacles that would define the most dangerous phase of their journey. On June 3, 1805, they reached a point where the Missouri River divided into two large branches, creating a navigation puzzle that could determine whether they reached the Pacific Ocean or died in the mountains. The northern branch was wider and carried more water, appearing to be the main stem of the Missouri River. The southern branch was narrower but flowed with the swift, clear current characteristic of mountain streams. Lewis and Clark faced a decision that would affect not only their own survival but the entire future of American expansion into the Western territories. If they chose the wrong branch, they would waste precious time traveling up a river that led nowhere, using up supplies and energy they could not afford to lose. Worse, they might find themselves trapped by winter in country where no rescue was possible and no food was available. The stakes could not have been higher. Yet they had no reliable information to guide their choice. The expedition's hunters and boatmen were unanimous in their belief that the northern branch was the true Missouri. It looked like the river they had been following for over a year, muddy and wide, carrying the same type of sediment and debris they had grown accustomed to. The southern branch looked different, clearer, swifter, more like a mountain stream than a plains river. But Lewis and Clark were troubled by subtle signs that pointed toward the southern branch. Sacagawea recognized landmarks that suggested they were approaching the Three Forks region where she had been captured, and she believed the southern branch led toward the mountains where her people hunted. The water in the southern branch was clearer and colder, suggesting a mountain source. Most importantly, the southern branch flowed from the direction where they expected to find the Continental Divide. The decision required the kind of leadership that transcends technical knowledge and enters the realm of intuition and judgment. Lewis and Clark could analyze the available evidence, but ultimately they would have to bet their lives and the lives of their men on their ability to read subtle signs in an alien landscape. They chose the southern branch, overruling the unanimous opinion of their own men and gambling everything on their interpretation of geographical clues that might prove misleading. Lewis set out on foot to scout ahead while Clark remained with the main party, both men understanding that they were committing themselves to a course of action that would either vindicate their judgment or destroy them all. Lewis's reconnaissance confirmed their choice in the most dramatic way possible. On June 13, 1805, he heard a sound that had been rumbling like distant thunder for miles, the roar of falling water that could only mean one thing. Following the sound to its source, he climbed a hill and saw one of the most spectacular sights in North America, the Great Falls of the Missouri River, a series of cascades that dropped the river nearly 400 feet in the space of 10 miles. The Great Falls were both a confirmation that they had chosen the correct branch of the river and a catastrophic obstacle that would test the expedition's endurance to its absolute limit. Lewis stood on the rim of the gorge watching millions of gallons of water crash over limestone ledges in displays of raw power that left him struggling for words adequate to describe what he was witnessing. The beauty was transcendent, but the practical implications were terrifying. There was no possibility of navigating the falls. The expedition would have to carry their boats, supplies, and equipment around the entire series of Cascades, a portage that would cover 18 miles of rough terrain and require every ounce of strength the men possessed. Worse, they would have to accomplish this portage while remaining constantly alert for grizzly bears, which were numerous in the area and seemed particularly aggressive during the summer months. Lewis's journal entry describing the Great Falls reveals a man torn between scientific wonder and practical despair. "I wished for the pencil of Salvator Rosa, a pen of Thomson, that I might be enabled to give to the enlightened world some just idea of this truly magnificent and sublimely grand object, which has from the commencement of time been concealed from the civilized world." But he also understood what the falls meant for the expedition's timeline and resources. The portage will be at least 16 miles and probably 20. Clark's response to Lewis's news demonstrated the practical leadership that had made him invaluable to the expedition's survival. While Lewis had focused on the aesthetic and scientific aspects of their discovery, Clark immediately began calculating the logistics of moving tons of equipment across nearly 20 miles of difficult terrain. He scouted potential routes, estimated the time required for the portage, and began redesigning their boats to make them lighter and more manageable for overland transport. The portage of the Great Falls began on June 21, 1805, and lasted nearly a month, testing the expedition's endurance, ingenuity, and determination in ways that no previous challenge had matched. The men constructed crude carts from cottonwood trees and iron fittings salvaged from their equipment, using the wheels to drag their canoes and supplies across ground that varied from smooth prairie to rocky ravines. The physical demands were almost beyond human capacity. The men worked in temperatures that often exceeded 100 degrees, their feet torn by sharp rocks and prickly pear cactus that penetrated even the thickest moccasins. The wooden carts repeatedly broke down, requiring constant repairs with dwindling supplies of tools and materials. Grizzly bears stalked the portage route, forcing the men to work in armed groups even when such precautions slowed their progress. Yet the expedition persevered through a combination of leadership, teamwork, and sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Lewis and Clark shared every hardship with their men, dragging carts, carrying supplies, and standing guard duty alongside the enlisted soldiers. The officers' willingness to endure the same privations they asked of their subordinates maintained morale during the darkest moments of the portage. Sacagawea's contributions during the Great Falls portage were particularly remarkable. She carried her infant son while gathering wild foods that supplemented the expedition's dwindling rations, identified water sources in seemingly barren country, and maintained the domestic routines that gave structure to camp life even under the most difficult circumstances. On one terrifying day, she nearly drowned when a flash flood caught her, Clark, and Charbonneau in a narrow ravine. But she saved her baby and preserved Clark's compass and other essential equipment despite the mortal danger. The successful completion of the Great Falls portage on July 15, 1805, marked a turning point in the expedition's relationship with the Western landscape. They had proven to themselves that American determination could overcome obstacles that seemed impossible when first encountered. They had demonstrated that careful planning, skilled leadership, and group cooperation could solve problems that would have defeated individual effort. But the portage had also cost them precious time and energy at a point in their journey when both were becoming critically scarce. Summer was advancing toward autumn, and they were still hundreds of miles from the Pacific Ocean. More immediately, they were approaching the headwaters of the Missouri River, where they would have to abandon water travel entirely and begin the mountain crossing that would determine whether they lived or died. As the expedition continued upstream from the Great Falls, the Missouri River gradually became smaller and swifter, dividing into branches that grew progressively more difficult to navigate. The surrounding landscape changed from rolling prairie to foothills, with mountain peaks visible on the western horizon like a promise and a threat. Every mile carried them closer to the moment when they would have to leave their boats behind and trust their lives to horses they had not yet obtained from people they had not yet found. The psychological pressure of this approaching transition weighed heavily on Lewis, whose journal entries began to show signs of the depression that had troubled him throughout his adult life. The immense responsibility of leading 33 people across unmapped territory was compounded by his growing understanding of how much could go wrong in the mountains. If they failed to find the Shoshone people, if Sacagawea could not establish communication with her relatives, if the Shoshone were unwilling or unable to provide horses, the entire expedition would be trapped in the Rockies with winter approaching and no means of escape. Clark remained steadier under pressure, focusing on the practical details of route finding and supply management that would give them the best chance of success regardless of what they encountered ahead. His maps of the Missouri River system were becoming increasingly detailed and accurate, providing future explorers with information that would be invaluable for decades. His relationships with the expedition's enlisted men remained strong, built on mutual respect and shared hardship that transcended the normal barriers between officers and soldiers. But even Clark was beginning to show the strain of continuous decision-making under life or death pressure. Every choice about route, timing, and resource allocation carried potentially fatal consequences. The margin for error was shrinking with each mile they traveled beyond the reach of rescue or resupply. The weight of responsibility for so many lives in such dangerous circumstances would have crushed men less capable than Lewis and Clark, and it was testing even their exceptional leadership abilities. On July 25, 1805, the expedition reached the Three Forks of the Missouri River, where three major streams converged to form the main stem they had been following for over a year. It was here that Sacagawea had been captured 5 years earlier, torn from her family and sold into slavery. The geographical significance of the location was matched by its emotional importance for the young woman whose knowledge and courage had become essential to the expedition's survival. Standing at the Three Forks, Lewis and Clark faced their final critical navigation decision. Which of the three branches would lead them most directly toward the Continental Divide and the Shoshone people they desperately needed to find? Sacagawea's memories of the area were helpful, but not decisive. She had been a child when captured, and 5 years of absence had dimmed her recollection of specific geographical details. They chose the westernmost branch, following Sacagawea's belief that it would lead toward the mountain passes her people used during their seasonal migrations. Lewis named the three streams after members of President Jefferson's cabinet, the Jefferson, Madison, and Gallatin Rivers, but the honors did nothing to reduce the anxiety that gripped the expedition as they pushed into increasingly rugged country. The Jefferson River wound through mountain valleys that grew progressively narrower and more difficult to navigate. The current became so swift that the men had to wade alongside their canoes, pulling them upstream by hand against water that seemed determined to sweep them back toward the plains they had left behind. The work was exhausting, but it carried them deeper into the heart of the Rocky Mountains, where every mile increased their chances of finding the Shoshone people. As August arrived, those chances seemed to be diminishing rather than improving. The expedition had seen no sign of human presence for weeks, despite traveling through country that should have been prime hunting territory for mountain tribes. The absence of Indians was both a relief, since it reduced the risk of hostile encounters, and a source of growing desperation, since their entire plan for crossing the mountains depended on establishing contact with the Shoshone. Lewis decided to take a small party ahead on foot, leaving Clark to bring the boats up the river more slowly. The separation was risky. It divided their already small force and created the possibility that one party might be attacked while the other was too far away to provide assistance. But time was running out, and Lewis believed that a small, fast-moving group had a better chance of finding Indians than the entire expedition moving at the speed of heavily loaded boats. On August 9, 1805, Lewis and his advance party reached a point where the Jefferson River became too small and shallow for further navigation. They had found the end of water travel, the place where the expedition would have to abandon their boats and continue on foot. But they had found no Shoshone people, no horses, and no clear route across the mountains that loomed ahead like an impenetrable wall. Standing at the headwaters of the Missouri River system, Lewis faced the greatest crisis of leadership in his life. Behind him lay 3,000 miles of American territory, most of it now familiar ground. Ahead lay the unknown spine of the continent, where wrong decisions would mean death not just for himself but for every person who had trusted him to lead them safely to the Pacific Ocean. The expedition was now completely dependent on finding Sacagawea's people, obtaining horses and locating a mountain pass that might or might not exist. They were carrying the hopes of a president, the territorial ambitions of a nation, and the scientific curiosity of a generation. But all of those grand purposes would mean nothing if they froze to death in the mountains or starved in the wilderness. Lewis looked west toward the Continental Divide, knowing that everything he had worked for, everything Jefferson had dreamed of, and everything his men had endured now depended on a reunion between a young Shoshone woman and the family she had been torn from as a child. The fate of American continental empire rested in the hands of people who had never heard of the United States, and whose decision to help or refuse help would echo across generations. The answer came on August 11, 1805, when Lewis climbed to the top of a ridge that had been taunting him for days and found himself standing on the Continental Divide. Below him, water flowed westward for the first time since leaving St. Louis, beginning its journey to the Pacific Ocean rather than the Atlantic. He had reached the backbone of North America, the geological spine that divided the continent's watersheds and marked the theoretical boundary between the known and unknown worlds. But the view from the divide destroyed the last remnant of Jefferson's beautiful delusion about Western geography. Lewis had expected to see a gradual descent toward the Pacific, perhaps another river system that would carry them downhill to the ocean. Instead, he found himself staring at wave after wave of mountain ranges stretching to the western horizon like a frozen sea. The Rockies were not a single ridge that could be crossed in a few days, but a vast mountain wilderness that would test every survival skill the expedition possessed. Lewis's journal entry from that day captures both the triumph and terror of the moment. I discovered immense ranges of high mountains still to the west of us with their tops partially covered with snow. He had solved the riddle of the Continental Divide, but the solution revealed challenges far greater than anything Jefferson had imagined when planning the expedition. The immediate problem was more pressing than long-term geography. Lewis's advance party had been searching for Shoshone people for 3 days without success, following increasingly faint trails that seemed to lead nowhere. They had found abandoned campsites and horse tracks, but no living people. Time was running out. Clark and the main party were struggling upstream with boats that would soon become completely useless, carrying supplies that would be desperately needed for the mountain crossing. Lewis made the decision that would determine whether the expedition succeeded or failed. On August 11th, he divided his small advance party even further, sending 2 men back to guide Clark while he pressed forward with only Hugh McNeil and George Drouillard in a final desperate search for Indians. It was an enormous gamble. 3 men alone in unmapped territory, vulnerable to accident, animal attack, or hostile warriors, but it was their last hope of finding the Shoshone before winter made travel impossible. The breakthrough came on August 12th, when Drouillard's exceptional tracking skills led them to a group of 3 Shoshone women gathering berries in a mountain meadow. Lewis approached slowly, calling out, "Tab-ba-bone," the Shoshone word for white man that Sacagawea had taught him. The women fled in terror, but one elderly woman remained, either too old to run or too wise to try. What happened next would become one of the most crucial diplomatic moments in American history. Though it took place between 3 American explorers and a frightened Shoshone grandmother in a mountain meadow that appeared on no map. Lewis approached with his hands raised, speaking gently in English while making universal gestures of peace. He offered the woman gifts, beads, a mirror, face paint, symbols of goodwill that transcended language barriers. The woman's fear gradually gave way to curiosity, then to something approaching welcome. She called back the other women, who returned cautiously to examine these strange pale visitors. Through gestures and the few Shoshone words he had learned from Sacagawea, Lewis managed to communicate that his party meant no harm and desperately needed to meet with Shoshone leaders. The women agreed to guide them to their main camp, beginning a tense procession through mountain terrain that could easily become a trap if the expedition had misjudged Shoshone intentions. Lewis and his companions were now completely at the mercy of people whose language they could not speak, whose culture they did not understand, and whose response to American requests for help remained utterly unpredictable. The Shoshone camp, when they reached it, presented a scene that clarified both the expedition's hopes and their challenges. About 60 warriors, women, and children were gathered in a mountain valley, their teepees arranged in a circle around a central fire. The people possessed the horses that Lewis desperately needed, dozens of sturdy mountain ponies that could carry men and supplies across terrain where no boat could travel. But the Shoshone also displayed the wariness of a people who had learned through bitter experience that strangers could bring disaster. These were not the powerful, confident tribes that Lewis and Clark had encountered on the Missouri River. The Shoshone were mountain refugees, driven from the plains by better-armed enemies, constantly moving to avoid war parties that could strike without warning. Their survival depended on mobility, caution, and the ability to disappear into mountain wilderness when threatened. The Shoshone chief, a man named Kamehameha, greeted Lewis with the formal courtesy due to important visitors, but his questions revealed the calculating mind of a leader responsible for his people's survival. He wanted to know how many Americans were coming, whether they carried weapons, and what they intended to do in Shoshone territory. Most importantly, he inquired whether the Americans were advance scouts for a larger force that might threaten Shoshone independence. Lewis found himself conducting the most important negotiation of his life through sign language and the few Shoshone phrases he could remember. He needed to convince Kamehameha that the expedition required horses and guides for their mountain crossing. But he also needed to avoid creating the impression that Americans intended to occupy or control Shoshone territory. The balance was delicate. He had to appear strong enough to be worthy of respect while seeming peaceful enough to avoid triggering defensive hostility. The breakthrough came when Lewis mentioned that his party included a Shoshone woman who had been captured years earlier and might be related to people in Kamehameha's band. The chief's interest sharpened immediately. Captured women sometimes returned with valuable information about enemy tribes or distant territories. More importantly, the return of a tribal member was a matter of honor and kinship obligation that transcended political calculations. Kamehameha agreed to accompany Lewis back to the main expedition, bringing several warriors and a small herd of horses, but Lewis could sense the chief's underlying skepticism about American promises and Shoshone stories. Too many tales of white men had ended in disappointment or disaster for Kamehameha to accept Lewis's assurances without concrete proof. The return journey to meet Clark and the main expedition became a test of Lewis's credibility that would determine whether the core of Discovery continued to the Pacific Ocean or perished in the mountains. Kamehameha's warriors were mounted on fast horses and could disappear into the wilderness at the first sign of deception. If Lewis had misrepresented the size or nature of his party, if Clark failed to appear where promised, if any detail of his story proved false, the Shoshone would vanish, and the expedition would be left without horses, guides, or hope of survival. The tension peaked on August 16th, when Lewis and the Shoshone party reached the appointed meeting place and found no sign of Clark or the main expedition. Hours passed with no explanation for the delay. Kamehameha's warriors grew increasingly restless, murmuring among themselves and casting suspicious glances at their American companions. Lewis could feel the situation deteriorating by the minute, but he had no way to explain Clark's absence or predict when the boats might appear. The crisis was resolved by Clark's competence and determination. Despite struggling against swift current and difficult terrain, he had pushed the boat party forward through sheer force of will, understanding that Lewis's life and the expedition's success depended on meeting the promised schedule. When the boats finally appeared around a bend in the river, carrying the American flag and loaded with men and equipment exactly as Lewis had described, Kamehameha's remaining doubts dissolved into amazement and respect. But the real miracle occurred when Sacagawea looked up from her son and saw Kamehameha approaching the landing site. Recognition flashed between them like lightning, followed by an eruption of emotion that transcended cultural boundaries. The Shoshone chief was not merely a tribal leader. He was Sacagawea's brother, the boy she had been playing with when Hidatsa raiders swept down on their camp 5 years earlier. The reunion between Sacagawea and Kemiawate represented one of those moments when individual human drama intersects with historical significance in ways that reshape both personal and national destinies. Lewis and Clark watched in amazement as their guide, the teenage mother they had known as Charbonneau's wife, and the expedition's translator revealed herself as the sister of the most powerful Shoshone leader in the region. Sacagawea's tears as she embraced her brother were matched by Kemiawate's obvious joy at finding his sister alive and well after years of uncertainty about her fate. But both siblings understood that their reunion had implications far beyond personal happiness. Sacagawea's presence with the American expedition provided the kind of family endorsement that made Shoshone cooperation not just possible, but morally obligatory. The negotiations that followed took on an entirely different character once Kemiawate understood that he was dealing with his sister's protectors rather than unknown strangers. Sacagawea served as translator, cultural interpreter, and advocate, explaining American needs while reassuring her brother about American intentions. Her knowledge of both cultures allowed her to bridge gaps in understanding that might otherwise have proven unbridgeable. Clark watched this diplomatic transformation with growing appreciation for the complexity of Sacagawea's role in the expedition. She was simultaneously translator, guide, diplomat, cultural broker, and family member navigating between worlds that had been unknown to each other until this moment. Her ability to maintain relationships and responsibilities in both cultures revealed forms of intelligence and strength that transcended any single category. The negotiations produced an agreement that would save the expedition and change the course of American history. Kemiawate agreed to provide horses, guides, and information about mountain passes in exchange for trade goods and the promise of future American friendship. More importantly, he agreed to delay his people's departure for their fall buffalo hunt, giving the expedition time to prepare for their mountain crossing. But the agreement also revealed the tragic dimensions of Sacagawea's situation. She had found her family after 5 years of separation, but her reunion would last only a few days before the expedition's schedule forced her to choose between staying with her people and continuing her journey to the Pacific. The bonds of slavery that tied her to Charbonneau, combined with her sense of responsibility to the expedition that had become her adopted family, made the choice inevitable but no less painful. Lewis and Clark began immediate preparations for the mountain crossing that would either carry them to the Pacific Ocean or become their tomb. They traded rifles, ammunition, and manufactured goods for 29 horses, enough to carry their essential supplies but not enough to ride. Most of the men would walk across the Continental Divide, leading pack animals through terrain that challenged even experienced mountain travelers. The Shoshone guides provided crucial information about the route ahead, but their descriptions revealed challenges that tested even Lewis's optimism. The mountain crossing would require at least 10 days through country where no game existed and no food could be obtained. The trail passed over ridges where early snow was possible even in late summer. The route was so difficult that even the Shoshone, who knew the mountains intimately, preferred to avoid it except when absolutely necessary. Perhaps most disturbing was the guide's description of the Nez Perce people who lived on the western side of the mountains. The Shoshone spoke of them with the mixture of respect and apprehension that mountain peoples reserve for powerful neighbors whose intentions remain uncertain. The Nez Perce were numerous, well-armed, and controlled the river routes that would carry the expedition down from the mountains toward the Pacific. If they proved hostile, the expedition would be trapped between impassable mountains and impassable enemies. On August 18th, the expedition began the most dangerous phase of their entire journey, following an ancient Indian trail called the Lolo Pass across the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana and Idaho. The trail had been used for generations by tribes crossing between the Great Plains and the Columbia River system, but it remained one of the most challenging routes in North America, a path that tested human endurance against some of the continent's most unforgiving terrain. The ascent began gradually, winding through mountain valleys where the expedition made reasonable progress despite increasingly difficult footing. But as they climbed higher, the trail became more treacherous, following narrow ridges where a single misstep could send horse and rider tumbling hundreds of feet into rocky canyons. The air grew thinner, making every exertion more difficult, while the temperature dropped toward freezing even in late August. Lewis's journal entries from the mountain crossing reveal a man struggling to maintain scientific objectivity while confronting the possibility of complete disaster. He continued to catalog new plant and animal species, measure temperatures, and record geographical observations, but his writing increasingly focused on the expedition's deteriorating condition and dwindling food supplies. The horses proved more fragile than expected, suffering from cuts, exhaustion, and the effects of high altitude. Several animals died from their injuries, reducing the expedition's carrying capacity just when they most needed it. The men were forced to abandon non-essential equipment, creating caches that they hoped to retrieve on their return journey but might never see again. By August 20th, the expedition was struggling through snow that made the trail nearly impossible to follow. The Shoshone guides, increasingly nervous about the lateness of the season and their own people's need to begin the buffalo hunt, began hinting that they should turn back before weather made the crossing impossible for everyone. The psychological pressure on Lewis was enormous. He could see his men suffering from hunger, cold, and exhaustion, but any decision to retreat would mean abandoning 2 years of effort and betraying Jefferson's trust. Worse, retreat might not be possible. They had already consumed too much of their food supply to return safely to the Missouri River, and winter would close the mountain passes before they could attempt another crossing. Clark took over practical leadership during the worst phase of the mountain crossing, his steady competence providing the kind of day-to-day problem-solving that kept the expedition moving forward when Lewis was paralyzed by the weight of command decisions. Clark redistributed loads to compensate for lost horses, found alternative routes when the main trail became impassable, and maintained the kind of calm optimism that prevented panic from destroying group morale. The crisis deepened on August 23rd, when the expedition encountered the most difficult terrain yet. Steep slopes covered with fallen timber that blocked every route and forced them to hack their way forward yard by yard. The men were now subsisting on portable soup and a few remaining scraps of salt pork, supplemented by whatever edible plants Sacagawea could identify in the high-altitude environment. The horses were dying faster than the men could replace them. Pack animals that had carried essential supplies fell from narrow trails or simply collapsed from exhaustion and malnutrition. The expedition was forced to slaughter some of their remaining horses for food, a desperate measure that reduced their carrying capacity while providing only temporary relief from starvation. On August 29th, after 11 days in the mountains, the expedition reached a moment of crisis that would determine whether they lived or died. Their food was nearly gone, their horses were dying, and early snow was beginning to fall with increasing frequency. The Shoshone guides were openly discussing abandonment, frightened by the deteriorating conditions and concerned about their own survival. Lewis made the hardest decision of his life. He sent Clark ahead with a small party to find the Nez Perce people and obtain food, while he remained with the main group to bring the horses and equipment forward as quickly as possible. The decision divided their tiny force at the moment of greatest danger, but it offered their only hope of avoiding complete disaster. Clark's advance party pushed forward through country that seemed designed to kill travelers. They crossed ridges where the trail disappeared under fresh snow, descended into valleys where no water could be found, and struggled through forests where fallen trees created barriers that took hours to circumvent. The men were so weak from hunger that they could barely walk, yet they continued moving because stopping meant death. The breakthrough came on September 2nd when Clark's party descended from the high peaks into the Waipi Prairie, where they encountered the first Nez Perce people. The meeting could have ended in violence. Clark's men were armed, desperate, and operating on the edge of panic from starvation. The Nez Perce were initially suspicious of these strange, pale visitors who appeared from the mountains like refugees from a disaster. What prevented bloodshed was the presence of several elderly Nez Perce women who had encountered white traders before and understood that these travelers were seeking help rather than threatening attack. The women convinced the warriors to provide food and shelter while sending messengers to alert the main Nez Perce village of the Americans' arrival. The food that the Nez Perce provided, dried salmon, camas root cakes, and fresh berries, saved Clark's advance party from starvation, but it also created a new crisis. The men's stomachs, shrunken from weeks of near fasting, could not handle the sudden abundance of rich, unfamiliar food. Several expedition members became violently ill, adding dysentery to their list of survival challenges. Meanwhile, Lewis and the main party were fighting their own battle against the mountains and weather. Early September brought heavy snow that made the trail almost impossible to follow and threatened to trap them in the high country where no food existed and no shelter could be found. The remaining horses were dying daily, forcing the men to carry increasingly heavy loads on foot through terrain that challenged even unburdened travelers. Lewis's physical and emotional condition was deteriorating as rapidly as his men's. The constant stress of life or death decision-making, combined with inadequate food and brutal physical conditions, was pushing him toward the kind of mental breakdown that had threatened him throughout his adult life. His journal entries became sporadic and increasingly dark, reflecting a man who was beginning to doubt whether any of them would survive their mountain ordeal. The reunion between Lewis and Clark's parties on September 4th provided emotional relief but highlighted the expedition's desperate condition. Both groups were weak, sick, and nearly broken by their mountain crossing. They had lost multiple horses, abandoned essential equipment, and consumed most of their remaining food supplies. Worst of all, they were now dependent on the goodwill of people they knew nothing about for their very survival. But the Nez Perce response to the expedition's plight revealed forms of generosity and wisdom that transcended cultural boundaries. Chief Twisted Hair and other tribal leaders understood immediately that these Americans were refugees rather than conquerors, people who needed help rather than people who posed threats. Despite the obvious risks of aiding unknown foreigners, the Nez Perce provided food, shelter, and medical care without demanding payment or guarantees. The decision to help the expedition reflected both Nez Perce cultural values and strategic thinking. Their society placed enormous emphasis on hospitality to travelers and assistance to people in distress. But they also understood that these Americans might be advance scouts for larger groups, and that generous treatment now could establish beneficial relationships for future interactions. Lewis and Clark found themselves experiencing a kind of generosity that challenged their assumptions about Indian peoples and American superiority. The Nez Perce were not the savage enemies described in frontier newspapers, but sophisticated people whose knowledge of mountain survival far exceeded anything the expedition had learned during 2 years in the wilderness. Their willingness to share resources with strangers demonstrated forms of civilization that Lewis had not expected to find in the remote mountains. The recovery period among the Nez Perce lasted nearly 2 weeks, giving the expedition time to regain their strength while preparing for the next phase of their journey. The men who had staggered out of the mountains like walking skeletons gradually recovered their health and morale under Nez Perce care. Equipment was repaired, new supplies were obtained through trade, and plans were made for the river journey that would carry them down from the mountains toward the Pacific Ocean. But the recovery also provided time for reflection on how close they had come to complete disaster. The mountain crossing had nearly killed them all, saved only by Nez Perce generosity and their own stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The experience had revealed both the expedition's limitations and their capacity to endure hardships that would have broken lesser groups. Clark used the time among the Nez Perce to gather information about the river route ahead, learning that the path to the Pacific would require navigating several major river systems through country controlled by numerous tribal groups. The Clearwater River would carry them to the Snake, which flowed into the Columbia, which eventually reached the ocean. But each river presented its own challenges, and each tribal territory required separate negotiations for safe passage. The expedition's relationship with the Nez Perce also provided Lewis and Clark with their first sustained exposure to a Pacific Northwest culture that differed significantly from the plains and mountain tribes they had previously encountered. The Nez Perce were salmon people, their entire economy and culture organized around the annual fish runs that provided the foundation of their diet. Their villages, Their seasonal migrations, their religious ceremonies, and their political structures all reflected adaptations to an environment where water rather than land provided the primary resources. Lewis's scientific mind was fascinated by Nez Perce salmon fishing techniques, their methods of food preservation, and their sophisticated understanding of river ecology. The tribe harvested salmon on a scale that astonished the Americans, thousands of fish dried on wooden racks, providing protein that would sustain large populations through the winter months. The abundance challenged Eastern assumptions about Indian poverty and demonstrated forms of resource management that European techniques had never achieved. But the expedition's time among the Nez Perce also revealed the continuing moral complexities that shadowed their mission. They were gathering information that would eventually guide American settlers into territories inhabited by peoples who had never consented to such settlement. The maps they created would facilitate American expansion at the expense of tribal sovereignty. The relationships they established would be exploited by future generations who lacked their hosts' generosity and wisdom. These contradictions would become more apparent as the expedition continued toward the Pacific, but for now they were obscured by immediate concerns about survival and route finding. The Nez Perce had saved them from death in the mountains, but the river journey ahead would test different skills and present new dangers that no amount of tribal hospitality could eliminate. On September 22, 1805, the expedition launched newly constructed dugout canoes on the Clearwater River, beginning the final phase of their journey to the Pacific Ocean. Behind them lay the most difficult terrain in North America, crossed successfully but at enormous cost. Ahead lay 1,000 miles of river navigation through country controlled by peoples whose languages they could not speak and whose intentions towards American travelers remained unknown. The current carried them away from the Nez Perce villages and toward the confluence with the Snake River, where they would enter the Columbia River system that Jefferson had dreamed would provide an easy water route to Asian markets. The dream had already been proven impossible. No commercially viable passage existed across the mountains they had just survived. But the expedition continued toward the Pacific, driven now by scientific curiosity, personal pride, and the simple determination to complete what they had started rather than by any realistic hope of finding the Northwest Passage. Lewis stood in the bow of the lead canoe, watching the river carry them toward whatever challenges awaited downstream. The current was swift but manageable, the weather was holding fair, and his men had recovered enough strength to handle the boats competently. For the first time since leaving the Mandan villages, he allowed himself to believe that they might actually reach the Pacific Ocean and return to tell Jefferson what they had discovered in the Western Territories. But the river ahead held dangers and wonders that would test their skills one final time before delivering them to the great ocean that had been their destination from the beginning. The Columbia River system would prove as challenging as the mountains they had crossed, and the tribal peoples who controlled its waters would present diplomatic puzzles as complex as any they had yet encountered. The expedition that had begun as Thomas Jefferson's dream of finding a water route to Asia was nearing its transformation into something far more significant. Proof that Americans could cross the continent, survive in its most forbidding landscapes, and return with knowledge that would change the nation's understanding of its own possibilities. The Snake River revealed itself as a different kind of adversary than the Missouri's muddy challenge, or the mountain's brutal indifference. Here, the water ran swift and clear through deep canyons carved from black volcanic rock, creating rapids that appeared without warning and whirlpools that could spin a loaded canoe like driftwood. The expedition had traded the familiar dangers of grizzly bears and starvation for the more subtle threats of drowning and being dashed against rocks in water too deep and swift for rescue. Clark's map-making skills proved essential as they navigated this alien landscape. The Snake wound through country that bore no resemblance to anything in their previous experience. Vast lava flows that stretched to the horizon like frozen black seas, punctuated by strange rock formations that rose from the earth like ancient monuments. The river had cut its channel through this volcanic terrain over thousands of years, creating a corridor of life through what was otherwise a desert wasteland. The expedition encountered new tribal groups at nearly every major confluence, each with their own languages, customs, and attitudes toward American travelers. The Palouse people controlled key fishing sites where massive salmon runs provided protein for hundreds of miles of river communities. The Walla Walla occupied strategic positions at river junctions where trade routes converged from multiple directions. Each group required separate negotiations, separate gifts, and separate assurances that the expedition meant no harm to their territorial interests. Lewis found these diplomatic encounters both fascinating and exhausting. Unlike the Plains tribes, who possessed clear hierarchical structures and well-defined territorial boundaries, the Columbia River peoples organized themselves around fishing sites, seasonal camps, and extended family networks that defied easy categorization. A single village might contain members of multiple tribes, while tribal leaders might control resources scattered across hundreds of miles of river frontage. The complexity was compounded by the expedition's growing reputation, which preceded them down the river through networks of communication that spanned the entire Pacific Northwest. Stories of the Americans had been passed from tribe to tribe. Tales of strange pale visitors who possessed powerful weapons, magical instruments, and a black man whose skin color suggested supernatural powers. Some stories were accurate, others wildly exaggerated, but all created expectations that Lewis and Clark struggled to manage. York's presence continued to generate intense curiosity among peoples who had never seen a person of African descent. But his role within the expedition was evolving in ways that complicated the simple master-slave relationship that defined his legal status. River navigation required skills that York possessed in abundance: strength, balance, and the kind of quick reflexes that could mean the difference between safety and disaster when a canoe struck an unexpected obstacle. Clark watched York's contributions with growing unease that he struggled to articulate even in his private journal. The man was clearly essential to the expedition's success, participating fully in decisions about route finding and camp security, yet he remained property that could be sold or punished at will. The contradiction was becoming more apparent as they encountered tribal peoples who treated York as an equal participant rather than as Clark's possession. The river journey also provided Sacagawea with opportunities to demonstrate knowledge that went beyond her familiarity with Shoshone territory. Her understanding of plant foods proved valuable in an environment where traditional game animals were scarce but edible roots and berries were abundant. She could identify safe camping sites, predict weather changes from atmospheric signs, and navigate social situations where her presence continued to serve as proof of peaceful intentions. But Sacagawea was also displaying signs of the psychological strain that affected everyone in the expedition as they moved further from familiar territory. She had left her brother and her people behind, choosing duty to the expedition over reunion with her family. The choice had been inevitable given her circumstances, but it carried emotional costs that became more apparent as the miles accumulated between her and the Shoshone homeland. Charbonneau, meanwhile, was proving increasingly unreliable as the expedition faced challenges that exceeded his experience as a frontier trader. His French-Canadian background had prepared him for river travel in familiar territory, but the Snake and Columbia rivers presented navigational puzzles that required skills he had never developed. Worse, his arrogant assumption that all Indians could be managed through the same techniques was creating diplomatic problems that Lewis and Clark had to constantly resolve. The expedition's most serious crisis on the Snake River occurred on October 7, 1805, when they attempted to run a set of rapids that local Indians had warned them to portage. Clark had scouted the rapids and judged them navigable, but his assessment proved dangerously optimistic when the lead canoe struck a hidden rock and began taking on water in the middle of the most violent current they had yet encountered. Lewis watched in horror as the canoe, carrying some of their most essential supplies, including irreplaceable scientific instruments and the only copies of several journal volumes, spun helplessly in the whirlpool below the rapids. The men in the canoe were fighting for their lives, bailing frantically while trying to steer towards shore, through water that seemed determined to drag them under. The rescue operation that followed demonstrated both the expedition's teamwork and their desperate vulnerability. Men who could barely swim plunged into water that could have killed them instantly, forming a human chain to guide the damaged canoe towards shore before it sank completely. Equipment that had traveled 3,000 miles from St. Louis was scattered across a mile of riverbank, some of it damaged beyond repair by its immersion in the freezing water. But the near disaster also revealed the kind of leadership that had carried the expedition through every previous crisis. Clark immediately organized salvage operations while Lewis conducted an inventory of damaged materials. Essential items were repaired or replaced using improvised techniques that frontier experience had taught them. Most importantly, both captains maintained the kind of calm competence that prevented panic from destroying group morale during moments of maximum stress. The local Indians who witnessed the rescue operation were impressed by the American seamanship and courage, but they were also puzzled by what seemed like unnecessary risk-taking. The rapids that had nearly destroyed the expedition were well-known hazards that experienced river travelers routinely avoided through portage routes that added only a few hours to the journey. The Americans' decision to run dangerous water rather than carry their boats around obstacles suggested either remarkable confidence or remarkable ignorance. Lewis understood the criticism implied in their host's polite questions about American navigation techniques. The expedition was indeed taking risks that local knowledge would have avoided, driven by time pressure and unfamiliarity with river conditions, but they were also demonstrating a kind of stubborn determination that impressed even critical observers and established their credentials as serious travelers rather than casual adventurers. The damaged equipment was repaired as well as circumstances allowed, but some losses proved irreplaceable. Scientific instruments calibrated in Philadelphia workshops could not be reconstructed in wilderness camps. Journal pages damaged by water retained their essential information, but lost the precise detail that made them valuable for navigation and scientific reference. The expedition was being worn down by incremental losses that individually seemed manageable, but collectively represented serious degradation of their capabilities. October brought new challenges as the expedition approached the confluence where the Snake River joined the Columbia. The weather was turning colder and wetter, with frequent storms that made river travel dangerous and camp life miserable. The autumn salmon runs were ending, reducing the food supplies that had sustained river communities throughout the summer months. Most concerning, the tribal peoples they encountered spoke increasingly of the Great River ahead, the Columbia system that would carry them to the Pacific, but also through territories controlled by peoples whose attitudes toward strangers remained unknown. The expedition's arrival at the Snake-Columbia confluence on October 16, 1805, marked their entry into the final phase of their westward journey. The Columbia River represented everything Jefferson had hoped to find in Western geography, a great water highway that flowed directly to the Pacific Ocean. But it also presented challenges that would test their skills and endurance one final time before delivering them to their destination. The Columbia proved to be everything the Missouri was not. Swift where the Missouri was sluggish, clear where the Missouri was muddy, flowing through deep canyons where the Missouri meandered across open plains. But it was also far more dangerous than anything they had yet navigated, with rapids that could destroy canoes instantly and currents that offered no second chances for navigational errors. The tribal peoples along the Columbia possessed a sophistication and complexity that surprised even Lewis's educated expectations. The Wanapam, Yakima, and other river communities had developed cultures entirely organized around salmon fishing, creating technologies and social structures that maximized their harvest of the annual fish runs. Their villages contained thousands of people during fishing season, supported by food preservation techniques that could store protein for entire communities through the winter months. But the Columbia River peoples also displayed a wariness towards strangers that reflected hard experience with European and American traders. Unlike the Plains tribes, who had encountered only scattered individual traders, the river communities had dealt with larger groups of white men whose intentions were not always peaceful. Some had been cheated in trades, others had seen their fishing sites disrupted by careless travelers, and all had heard stories of conflicts between Indians and whites in other territories. Lewis and Clark found themselves conducting diplomacy under conditions of mutual suspicion that required extraordinary tact and patience. They needed information about river conditions, permission to pass through tribal territories, and access to food supplies that could sustain them during the final push to the ocean. But they also had to convince skeptical leaders that 33 armed Americans posed no threat to communities that had learned to view large groups of strangers as potential enemies. The negotiations were complicated by language barriers that exceeded anything they had previously encountered. The Columbia River region was home to dozens of distinct languages and dialects, many of them unrelated to the Algonquian and Siouan languages that Drouillard and other expedition members could speak. Communication often required chains of translation that passed through multiple interpreters, creating countless opportunities for misunderstanding and diplomatic failure. Sacagawea's presence remained crucial during these encounters, but her effectiveness was limited by her unfamiliarity with Pacific Northwest cultures. Her knowledge of Shoshone customs and languages provided little guidance for dealing with peoples whose entire way of life was organized around river resources rather than mountain hunting. She was learning as rapidly as the rest of the expedition, but they were all operating without the cultural knowledge that had made their plains and mountain negotiations successful. The expedition's first major diplomatic crisis on the Columbia occurred at Celilo Falls, where the river dropped through a series of cascades that required extensive portage operations. The falls were also one of the most important fishing sites in North America, controlled by tribal communities that had harvested salmon there for thousands of years and defended their rights against all comers. The portage around Celilo Falls would require several days of difficult labor, carrying boats and equipment over rocky terrain while remaining constantly alert for accidents that could destroy essential supplies. But the work would have to be accomplished under the watchful eyes of tribal fishermen who regarded any disruption of their operations as a threat to their survival. A single misjudgment or cultural insensitivity could transform a routine portage into a deadly confrontation. Lewis approached the Celilo Falls negotiations with the scientific curiosity that had characterized his response to every new environment. He was fascinated by fishing techniques that could harvest salmon on an industrial scale using only traditional technologies. The fish ladders, weirs, and drying racks represented solutions to resource management problems that European techniques had never addressed so effectively. But Clark's practical mind focused on the immediate challenge of moving the expedition past this obstacle without triggering a conflict that could destroy them. The falls were surrounded by hundreds of Indian fishermen whose territorial rights were ancient and absolute. Any American mistake that interfered with salmon fishing operations could justify retaliation that would leave no survivors to report what had happened. The resolution came through a combination of respect for tribal authority and demonstration of American capabilities that impressed even skeptical observers. Lewis and Clark formally requested permission to portage around the falls, offering payment in trade goods and accepting tribal supervision of their operations, but they also demonstrated their rifles' accuracy and their air guns' mysterious power, establishing military credibility that discouraged any thoughts of taking advantage of the expedition's apparent weakness. The portage operation itself became a display of American competence and tribal knowledge working in cooperation. Indian guides showed the expedition the safest routes around the falls, while American strength and equipment accomplished the heavy lifting required to move boats and supplies over difficult terrain. The collaboration produced mutual respect that transcended cultural boundaries and established the foundation for peaceful passage through the remainder of Columbia River territory. But the success at Celilo Falls also revealed how dependent the expedition had become on the goodwill of peoples whose interests were not necessarily aligned with American objectives. They were no longer explorers moving through empty wilderness, but supplicants seeking passage through territories controlled by sovereign peoples who could grant or deny safe conduct based on their own calculations of risk and benefit. Lewis's journal entries from this period reflect a man grappling with the implications of what the expedition had discovered about Western geography and politics. The territories Jefferson had purchased from Napoleon were not empty lands waiting to be claimed, but complex human landscapes where dozens of tribal nations exercised effective sovereignty over resources that any American expansion would eventually require. The moral complexity of their mission was becoming unavoidable as they approached the Pacific Ocean. Every mile of their journey was creating knowledge that would facilitate American settlement of lands inhabited by peoples who had never consented to such settlement. Every friendship they established was potentially a relationship that future Americans would exploit or betray. Every map they drew was a document that would guide armies as well as explorers. Clark's response to these realizations was more pragmatic than Lewis's philosophical anguish. He understood that their mission was to gather information, not to resolve the moral contradictions inherent in American expansion. The expedition's success would be measured by their ability to reach the Pacific and return with useful knowledge, not by their capacity to solve problems that exceeded the authority Jefferson had given them. But Clark was also developing personal relationships with tribal peoples that complicated his official role as an agent of American expansion. His friendship with various chiefs, his affection for Sacagawea and her son, and his respect for York's contributions were creating emotional attachments that transcended purely diplomatic considerations. He was becoming invested in the welfare of people whose interests might ultimately conflict with American territorial ambitions. The expedition continued down the Columbia through November weather that grew progressively worse as they approached the ocean. Rain fell almost constantly, soaking through their clothing and equipment despite every effort to maintain waterproof storage. The river itself was swollen with autumn runoff, creating currents that were stronger and more unpredictable than anything they had encountered during the dry summer months. But the approaching Pacific also brought new forms of evidence that they were nearing their destination. Tide pools appeared in tributary streams, proving that ocean influences were reaching inland through the river system. The forests changed character, with massive cedar and fir trees that dwarfed anything in their previous experience. Most dramatically, they began encountering tribal peoples who possessed European-manufactured goods, brass kettles, iron tools, and woolen cloth that could only have come from maritime traders. The presence of European goods in Indian villages created both excitement and apprehension among expedition members. Trade items proved that the Pacific was indeed accessible to ocean-going vessels, confirming Jefferson's basic geographical assumptions about Western water routes. But they also suggested that other nations were already establishing commercial relationships with Columbia River tribes, potentially complicating American claims to territorial sovereignty in the region. Lewis questioned tribal leaders extensively about their sources of European goods, learning that British and American trading ships regularly visited the Columbia River mouth during summer months. The ships brought manufactured items in exchange for furs, establishing economic relationships that made Columbia River peoples far more sophisticated in their dealings with white traders than the Plains tribes had been. This commercial sophistication created new diplomatic challenges as Lewis and Clark approached the river's mouth. The tribal peoples they encountered were experienced negotiators who understood European trading practices and could evaluate American offers against alternatives provided by maritime traders. They were not impressed by trade goods that they could obtain more easily from ships, and they were skeptical of American promises that could not be immediately verified. The expedition's final approach to the Pacific Ocean began on November 7, 1805, when Clark wrote in his journal the words that would echo across American history: "Great joy in camp we are in view of the ocean, this great Pacific Octean which we've been so long anxious to see." The excitement was premature, as they were actually seeing the Columbia River estuary rather than the open ocean. But it reflected the profound emotion of men who had traveled 4,000 miles to reach this moment. But the weather and geography of the Columbia River mouth proved as challenging as any obstacle they had yet encountered. Fierce storms drove waves up the river with enough force to swamp their canoes, while constant rain made camping almost impossible. They were trapped for days at a time on narrow beaches, pinned between the violent river and steep hills that offered no shelter from the relentless precipitation. The storms revealed how completely they remained at the mercy of natural forces even after crossing an entire continent. All their skills, all their equipment, all their accumulated experience could not protect them from Pacific Northwest weather that turned their final triumph into a struggle for basic survival. They had reached the ocean, but they could not reach the ships that might carry them home. The psychological impact of this final trial was particularly severe because it came at the moment when they should have been celebrating their success. Instead of triumphant arrival at their destination, they found themselves enduring some of the most miserable conditions of their entire journey. The rain penetrated every shelter they could construct. Their food supplies were running dangerously low, and several men were showing signs of illness that could become serious without proper care. Lewis's mental state deteriorated rapidly under the combined stress of physical misery and frustrated expectations. He had imagined their arrival at the Pacific as a moment of scientific discovery and personal vindication, but the reality was cold, wet, and profoundly uncomfortable. His journal entries became sporadic and increasingly pessimistic, reflecting a man whose emotional reserves had been depleted by 2 years of continuous stress and responsibility. Clark took over practical leadership during this crisis, as he had during the mountain crossing and other moments when Lewis was overwhelmed by the weight of command. He organized the men's activities to maintain morale, supervised food distribution to prevent waste, and explored possible winter campsites that might provide better shelter than their exposed position near the river mouth. The decision about where to spend the winter became the most democratic moment in the expedition's history. Clark proposed several possible locations and asked every member of the expedition, including York and Sacagawea, to vote on their preference. The unprecedented inclusion of an enslaved man and an Indian woman in formal decision-making reflected both the expedition's desperate circumstances and Clark's recognition that survival would require everyone's cooperation regardless of their official status. The vote favored establishing winter quarters on the south side of the Columbia River, in what would later become the state of Oregon. The location offered better protection from storms, access to fresh water and timber, and proximity to Indian villages where trade relationships might provide essential supplies during the winter months. But it also committed the expedition to 4 months in the most miserable climate they had yet encountered, with no guarantee that ships would arrive in spring to carry them home. The construction of Fort Clatsop began in early December 1805, with every member of the expedition contributing labor despite illness, exhaustion, and the constant challenge of working in rain that seemed never to end. The fort was a simple rectangular stockade with living quarters for the men, storage rooms for equipment and supplies, and workshops where they could maintain their weapons and prepare specimens for the return journey. But Fort Clatsop was more than a winter shelter. It was proof that Americans could establish permanent structures on the Pacific coast, demonstrating territorial claims that maritime traders from other nations would have to acknowledge. The expedition had reached the ocean and built a fort, creating facts on the ground that supported American sovereignty over the Oregon Territory regardless of what European diplomats might negotiate in distant capitals. The winter at Fort Clatsop would test the expedition's endurance one final time, but it would also provide the time necessary to prepare for a return journey that would carry news of their discoveries back to a nation that had waited anxiously for word from the western wilderness. They had reached the Pacific Ocean, but their mission would not be complete until they delivered their maps, specimens, and reports to the president who had sent them into the unknown. The winter of 1805 to 1806 at Fort Clatsop became a test of endurance that challenged every assumption the expedition had made about their own resilience. The Pacific Northwest rain fell with a relentless monotony that penetrated their souls as thoroughly as it soaked through their shelters. In 4 months, they would record only 12 days without precipitation. The constant dampness rotted their clothes, rusted their weapons, and created a perpetual chill that no fire could entirely banish. Lewis sank deeper into the depression that had shadowed him throughout his adult life. The triumph of reaching the Pacific had dissolved into the grinding misery of counting days until spring might release them from their self-imposed prison. His journal entries became mechanical recitations of weather conditions and supply inventories, stripped of the wonder and scientific curiosity that had animated his writing during the outbound journey. Clark maintained the expedition's daily routines through sheer force of will, organizing hunting parties, supervising equipment maintenance, and conducting the diplomatic relations with local Clatsop and Chinook peoples that kept them supplied with food and information. His steady competence provided the stability that prevented the expedition from fragmenting under the psychological pressure of isolation and boredom. But even Clark struggled with the weight of responsibility during the long winter months. He was watching his men deteriorate physically and mentally, seeing Lewis withdraw into brooding silence and calculating supply levels that suggested they might not have enough resources to survive the return journey. Every decision about food distribution, every trade negotiation with local Indians, every assignment of duties carried life or death implications that no amount of frontier experience had prepared him to handle. York's situation became more complex during the winter months as the Democratic vote on their winter quarters forced everyone to confront the contradictions of his status within the expedition. He had been asked to participate in crucial decisions as an equal member of the group, yet he remained Clark's property with no legal rights to the freedom he had earned through 18 months of essential service. The tension was becoming unbearable for both men, though neither could openly acknowledge it. Sacagawea found herself serving as cultural interpreter between the expedition and the Clatsop peoples, whose customs and social organization differed dramatically from anything she had known in the mountain regions. The Pacific coastal tribes possessed wealth and sophistication that amazed the expedition members, but their complex ceremonial obligations and intricate trading relationships created diplomatic challenges that required constant attention to avoid giving offense. The winter also provided time for reflection on what the expedition had accomplished and what their discoveries meant for the future of American expansion. Lewis and Clark had proven that overland travel to the Pacific was possible, but they had also demonstrated that no commercially viable route existed across the continental mountains. The Northwest Passage that had motivated Jefferson's vision was a myth, destroyed by the reality of geography that no amount of wishful thinking could overcome. More significantly, they had documented the existence of dozens of sophisticated tribal nations whose territorial claims and political sovereignty would complicate any American expansion into western regions. The maps they were creating would guide future settlers, but they would also reveal the extent to which western territories were already inhabited by peoples who had never consented to American occupation. The moral weight of this knowledge pressed heavily on Lewis during the dark winter months. He understood that their scientific discoveries and geographical information would be used to justify policies that displaced the very peoples who had made their survival possible. The friendship and generosity they had received from tribal hosts would be repaid with territorial seizure and cultural destruction that no individual goodwill could prevent. Clark's response to these moral complexities remained more pragmatic. He focused on immediate responsibilities, keeping his men alive, maintaining diplomatic relations with local tribes, and preparing for a return journey that would test their endurance as severely as the outbound trip. The broader implications of American expansion were problems for politicians and future generations to resolve. But Clark was also forming personal attachments that complicated his official role as an explorer and territorial agent. His affection for Sacagawea's son had deepened into genuine paternal feelings, leading him to make private plans for the boy's education and future that went far beyond his formal obligations. His friendship with various tribal leaders had created emotional bonds that transcended diplomatic necessity. Most troublingly, his relationship with York was evolving in ways that challenged the master-slave dynamic that legally defined their connection. The expedition's isolation at Fort Clatsop was broken periodically by visits from local Indians bringing trade goods, information about weather conditions, and news from other parts of the Columbia River system. These contacts provided essential supplies but also reminded the Americans of their complete dependence on indigenous goodwill for survival in an environment they still barely understood. The most significant of these encounters occurred in January 1806, when Clatsop messengers brought word that a whale had washed ashore some distance south of their fort. Sacagawea immediately expressed strong desire to see this creature, which she had never imagined during her mountain childhood. Her request revealed both her curiosity about the ocean world that had become her temporary home and her growing confidence in asserting her own interests within the expedition's hierarchy. Clark organized a small party to visit the whale, partly to obtain oil and blubber for their dwindling food supplies, but largely to satisfy Sacagawea's wish to see the ocean and its creatures. The journey became a moment of wonder that briefly lifted the expedition's spirits above the grinding routine of winter survival. Sacagawea stood on the Pacific beach, holding her infant son while watching waves roll in from an ocean that stretched beyond the horizon toward distant continents. Her presence at the edge of the American continent symbolized both the expedition's success in crossing an entire landmass and the complex human cost of that achievement. She had traveled farther from her birthplace than any Shoshone person in history, but she had done so as property rather than as a free agent pursuing her own dreams. The whale itself was a massive creature that dwarfed anything the expedition members had encountered in their terrestrial travels. Lewis's scientific mind was fascinated by its anatomy and the ecological relationships that could support such enormous marine life. But the whale was also a reminder of how much about the Pacific world remained unknown to American science and how inadequately their brief coastal visit had prepared them to understand this new environment. The return to Fort Clatsop brought renewed focus on preparations for the journey home. Lewis and Clark had decided to attempt their return during the spring of 1806, gambling that early departure would allow them to cross the Rocky Mountains before summer heat made travel unbearable on the eastern plains. The decision required careful calculation of food supplies, equipment needs, and timing that would either deliver them safely to St. Louis or trap them in mountain terrain where rescue was impossible. The preparation process revealed how much the expedition had been changed by their experiences. The men who would begin the return journey were profoundly different from the soldiers and frontiersmen who had left St. Louis 2 years earlier. They had acquired survival skills that no military training could have taught, developed friendships that transcended racial and cultural boundaries, and gained geographical knowledge that would reshape American understanding of Western territories. But they had also been worn down by constant stress, inadequate nutrition, and the psychological pressure of operating beyond the reach of civilization for nearly 2 years. Several men were showing signs of chronic illness that threatened their ability to endure another transcontinental journey. Equipment that had been manufactured in Philadelphia workshops was held together by improvised repairs that might fail at crucial moments. Most concerning was Lewis's mental state, which had deteriorated throughout the winter months to a point that worried even Clark's optimistic temperament. The expedition's leader was struggling with depression that made decision-making increasingly difficult and sapped the energy he would need for the challenges ahead. Clark found himself assuming more and more of the leadership responsibilities while trying to support his friend through a psychological crisis that neither man fully understood. As March 1806 arrived, the expedition began final preparations for departure with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. They were eager to leave the miserable climate of the Pacific coast, but they were also aware that the return journey would test their diminished capabilities against obstacles that had nearly defeated them when they were stronger. The mountain crossing that awaited them would be attempted with less equipment, weaker men, and leaders who had been pushed closer to their breaking points. On March 23, 1806, the Corps of Discovery abandoned Fort Clatsop and began their journey home, paddling up the Columbia River against the current that had carried them to the ocean 6 months earlier. The fort they left behind stood as a monument to American determination and proof of territorial claims that would influence Pacific Northwest politics for generations. The upstream journey on the Columbia tested the expedition's remaining strength against river conditions that seemed designed to prevent their escape from the Pacific watershed. The spring runoff had turned the river into a torrent that fought their every mile of progress, while tribal peoples who had been friendly during the winter now seemed more suspicious of the heavily armed Americans traveling against the natural flow of commerce and communication. The expedition's reputation had evolved during their winter on the coast, spreading through intertribal communication networks that connected Pacific communities with inland peoples. Stories of their technological capabilities, their peaceful intentions, and their desperate dependence on tribal assistance had created a complex mixture of curiosity, respect, and calculation among potential hosts. Some tribal leaders saw opportunity in developing relationships with representatives of the American government. Others viewed the expedition as advanced scouts for territorial invasion that would eventually threaten indigenous sovereignty. Most adopted a cautious middle course, providing necessary assistance while avoiding commitments that might prove disadvantageous when larger numbers of Americans arrived. Lewis struggled with these diplomatic complexities as the expedition retraced their route through Columbia River territories. His depression made the constant negotiation and cultural sensitivity required for safe passage increasingly difficult, forcing Clark to assume primary responsibility for maintaining the relationships that kept them supplied and protected. The most challenging negotiations occurred at Celilo Falls, where the expedition had to reverse the portage process that had carried them downstream in the previous autumn. The fishing season was beginning, bringing hundreds of tribal members to harvest sites that the expedition's passage would necessarily disrupt. The Americans needed permission not just to portage their boats, but to interfere with economic activities that sustained entire communities through the annual salmon runs. Clark's diplomatic skills proved essential in securing safe passage through these negotiations. He had learned during the winter months to approach tribal leaders with the respect due to sovereign authorities rather than the condescension that characterized most American dealings with Indian peoples. His genuine appreciation for indigenous knowledge and his willingness to accept tribal supervision of the portage operations created cooperation that might otherwise have been withheld. But the success at Celilo Falls could not resolve the fundamental tension between expedition needs and tribal interests. Every request for assistance, every negotiation for supplies, every demand for territorial passage was extracting costs from peoples who had already provided far more help than any reasonable person could have expected. The expedition was becoming a burden on communities whose generosity had been stretched beyond the point of sustainability. This reality weighed heavily on Lewis as they continued upstream toward the Snake River confluence. He was acutely aware that their survival depended on continued exploitation of indigenous resources and knowledge, yet he could offer nothing in return except vague promises of future American friendship that might prove worthless when political circumstances changed. The transition from the Columbia to the Snake River system brought the expedition back into territory they had traversed during the previous autumn. But the familiar landmarks offered little comfort. They were now traveling against the current during spring runoff, making progress that had been relatively easy downstream into a constant battle against water that seemed determined to sweep them back toward the Pacific. The physical demands of upstream travel were crushing weakened men who had endured a winter of inadequate nutrition and constant dampness. The expedition members were showing signs of scurvy, dysentery, and other diseases that threatened their ability to continue, much less survive the mountain crossing that awaited them. Clark found himself conducting daily medical evaluations that determined work assignments and travel schedules based on each man's capacity to contribute to group survival. York's condition was particularly concerning, not because his health was worse than others, but because his essential contributions to expedition success were becoming undeniable even as his legal status remained unchanged. He was carrying loads that would have challenged healthy men, providing strength and endurance that kept essential equipment moving upstream, yet he remained property that could be sold or abandoned at his owner's discretion. The contradiction was becoming impossible for Clark to ignore or rationalize. York had earned freedom through service that exceeded any reasonable obligation, but acknowledging that fact would require Clark to confront the entire system of slavery that had shaped his Virginia upbringing and continued to define his economic interests. The moral complexity was easier to avoid than to resolve, but avoidance was becoming psychologically impossible. Sacagawea's role during the return journey revealed the full extent of her contributions to expedition success. Her knowledge of river routes, food sources, and tribal customs had become indispensable for navigation through territories that remained alien to American eyes. She was simultaneously guide, interpreter, diplomat, and cultural broker, managing relationships between worlds that had been unknown to each other before her presence made communication possible. But Sacagawea was also approaching a moment of personal crisis that would define the rest of her life. The expedition was carrying her away from the Pacific coastal peoples who had become her temporary community, and toward eventual separation from the only family she had known since being torn from her childhood home. Her son was growing into a toddler whose future would be determined by decisions she had no legal right to make, despite her obvious devotion and competence as a mother. The expedition reached the Snake Clearwater confluence in early May 1806, entering Nez Perce territory where they hoped to recover horses and equipment cached during their westbound journey. The reunion with Twisted Hair and other Nez Perce leaders who had aided them during the previous autumn was complicated by political changes that had occurred during their absence. Tribal leadership had shifted in response to pressures from neighboring peoples and changing patterns of resource availability. Leaders who had been friendly during the expedition's desperate arrival from the mountains were now more cautious about supporting American interests. The horses that Lewis and Clark had left in Nez Perce care had been scattered among different families, requiring separate negotiations with multiple owners who were not necessarily committed to honoring previous agreements. The recovery process stretched over several weeks, during which the expedition was forced to remain in Nez Perce territory while tribal leaders debated among themselves about the wisdom of continuing to assist American travelers. The delay was frustrating for men eager to begin their mountain crossing before summer heat made plains travel unbearable, but it also provided time for rest and recovery that several expedition members desperately needed. Lewis used the delay to conduct scientific observations and gather specimens, but his heart was clearly not in the work that had once provided his greatest satisfaction. The depression that had begun during the winter at Fort Clatsop was deepening into something that threatened his ability to function as expedition leader. Clark watched his friend with growing concern, understanding that Lewis's mental state would affect not just individual welfare but the survival of every person under their command. The Nez Perce eventually agreed to provide horses and guides for the mountain crossing, but their cooperation came with warnings that made the Americans reconsider their departure timing. The tribal leaders explained that snow conditions in the high passes remained impassable, and that attempting the crossing too early would result in certain death for the entire party. The Americans would have to wait until late June or early July before the mountains would be safe for travel. The delay meant spending additional weeks among the Nez Perce, consuming food and resources that might be needed for the journey ahead while trying to maintain diplomatic relationships that were being strained by extended contact. Lewis and Clark found themselves walking a tightrope between expedition needs and tribal patience, understanding that a single diplomatic misjudgment could strand them permanently in mountain territory. But the extended stay also provided opportunities for deeper cultural exchange that revealed the sophistication of Nez Perce civilization and the extent to which American assumptions about indigenous peoples were based on ignorance and prejudice. The expedition members were living among people whose knowledge of mountain ecology, seasonal cycles, and resource management far exceeded anything they had learned in their own frontier experience. Lewis's scientific curiosity was occasionally sparked by observations of Nez Perce agricultural techniques, medical practices, and social organization. He documented methods of root cultivation, food preservation, and seasonal migration that represented solutions to environmental challenges that European techniques had never successfully addressed. But even his scientific writing lacked the enthusiasm that had characterized his earlier discoveries. Clark used the time to improve his maps of the mountain region, incorporating Nez Perce geographical knowledge that provided details no American cartographer had ever recorded. The tribal leaders could describe river systems, mountain passes, and seasonal hunting grounds across hundreds of square miles of territory, providing information that would prove invaluable for future American activities in the region. But the map-making process also revealed the extent to which American exploration was documenting indigenous knowledge rather than making original discoveries. Every significant geographical feature, every viable travel route, every resource location was already known to tribal peoples who had been using and managing the landscape for generations. The expedition's discoveries were largely a matter of translating existing knowledge into European cartographic conventions. This realization added another layer to Lewis's growing depression. He had imagined himself as a pioneer pushing back the boundaries of human knowledge, but the reality was that he was primarily serving as a conduit for information that indigenous peoples were sharing with varying degrees of willingness and trust. His role was important, but not heroic in the way he had originally conceived it. The mountain crossing finally began in late June 1806. Guided by Nez Perce leaders who understood that American survival depended entirely on indigenous expertise and assistance. The expedition that had nearly perished during their westbound crossing now attempted the return journey with even less margin for error, entrusting their lives to tribal knowledge that represented their only hope of reaching familiar territory alive. The ascent into the Bitterroot Mountains revealed how little the Americans had learned about high-altitude survival despite their previous experience. They were still dependent on their guides for route finding, still vulnerable to weather changes that could trap them above the tree line, still carrying inadequate supplies for the extended journey across terrain where no resources existed to sustain human life. But the expedition members had also acquired psychological resilience that had been absent during their westbound crossing. They understood now that mountain travel required patience, careful planning, and acceptance of conditions beyond human control. The panic that had threatened group cohesion during their first mountain ordeal was replaced by grim determination that carried them forward despite fear and physical suffering. Lewis's mental state improved somewhat during the mountain crossing, as if physical challenge provided relief from the psychological burdens that had overwhelmed him during periods of relative comfort. He resumed regular journal entries and began displaying something approaching his former scientific curiosity about high-altitude ecology and weather patterns. But even Lewis's improvement could not mask the expedition's overall deterioration. The men were weaker than they had been during the westbound journey. Their equipment was held together by improvised repairs, and their food supplies were calculated to provide only minimal nutrition during the crossing. They were attempting one of the most dangerous phases of their entire journey with reduced capabilities and increased vulnerability to accidents or delays. The successful completion of the mountain crossing on July 3, 1806, marked the expedition's return to territory they could navigate independently. But it also began the final phase of their journey through familiar landscapes that had been transformed by their experiences. The Missouri River headwaters that had challenged them so severely during the westbound journey now felt like a highway leading toward home. But the expedition members were returning as different people to a world that might not understand what they had accomplished. Lewis and Clark made the decision that would define the remainder of their homeward journey. They would divide the expedition to explore different routes and gather additional geographical information before reuniting for the final approach to St. Louis. The decision reflected their confidence in both groups' survival capabilities and their commitment to maximizing the scientific value of their return journey. Lewis took a small party north to explore the Marias River, hoping to determine whether its headwaters extended far enough north to provide access to Canadian territory that might be claimed by the United States. Clark led the larger group south and east toward the Yellowstone River, following what he believed would be a more direct route toward the Missouri confluence where they had originally encountered the river system. The division created the expedition's most dangerous moment since leaving the Pacific coast. On July 27th, Lewis's party encountered a group of Blackfeet warriors who were initially friendly, but became hostile when they realized the Americans possessed weapons and horses that could be seized. The confrontation escalated into the expedition's only deadly violence, resulting in the death of 2 Blackfeet warriors and Lewis's realization that they had created enemies who would pursue them with lethal intent. The killing of the Blackfeet warriors marked a turning point in Lewis's understanding of his mission and its implications. For 2 years, the expedition had maintained peaceful relations with every tribal group they encountered, using diplomacy and cultural sensitivity to avoid the violence that characterized most frontier contact between Americans and Indians. The Blackfeet encounter revealed how easily peaceful exploration could become deadly conflict when territorial interests collided with survival necessities. Lewis's party fled the scene of the killings and raced toward their rendezvous with Clark, understanding that Blackfeet retaliation could destroy the entire expedition if they were caught in territory where their enemies possessed overwhelming numerical superiority. The chase continued for days, with Lewis's men pushing their horses to exhaustion while constantly scanning the horizon for war parties that might appear at any moment. Meanwhile, Clark's party was making good progress down the Yellowstone River, but they were also encountering evidence of increased Indian activity that suggested the expedition's presence was being tracked by multiple tribal groups. The Americans' reputation had preceded them through the complex communication networks that connected Plains peoples across hundreds of miles, creating awareness of their movements and capabilities that made surprise encounters less likely, but political calculations more complex. The 2 parties reunited on August 12, 1806, at the confluence of the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers, bringing together expedition members who had been separated for over a month during some of the most dangerous territory travel they had yet attempted. The reunion was joyful, but subdued by recognition that they had crossed a line from exploration to conflict that would influence all future American activities in western regions. Lewis's account of the Blackfeet killings troubled Clark deeply, not because he disagreed with his friend's actions under life-threatening circumstances, but because he understood the broader implications for American Indian relations in territories that would soon be flooded with settlers and soldiers. The peaceful exploration that Jefferson had envisioned was giving way to territorial conflict that would define Western expansion for the next century. But the reunion also marked the beginning of their final approach to familiar territory, where they would transition from explorers surviving an unknown wilderness to returning heroes carrying news of continental discovery. The Missouri River that had challenged them so severely during their westbound journey now carried them downstream towards settlements, supply stations, and eventually the civilization they had left behind more than 2 years earlier. The psychological transition proved more difficult than the physical challenges of river travel. Men who had adapted to life beyond the boundaries of American society found themselves struggling to readjust to concepts of private property, legal authority, and social hierarchy that had been suspended during their wilderness experience. The egalitarian cooperation that had sustained them through countless crises was giving way to the familiar structures of military discipline and civilian authority. York's situation became increasingly unbearable as the expedition approached American settlements, where his legal status as Clark's property would be enforced by courts and communities that had not witnessed his essential contributions to continental exploration. He had voted on expedition decisions, participated in diplomatic negotiations, and risked his life repeatedly to ensure group survival. Yet he was returning to a world that would deny him the most basic human rights. Sacagawea faced her own difficult transition as the expedition carried her towards separation from the only family she had known since being torn from her Shoshone relatives. Clark's growing attachment to her son was creating possibilities for the boy's education and advancement in American society, but it also threatened to divide her from her child in the same way that slavery had divided countless families throughout the United States. The expedition reached the first American settlement at La Charette, Missouri, on September 20th, 1806, encountering people who had assumed they were dead after more than 2 years without communication from the western wilderness. The settlement's astonishment at their survival and return provided the first indication of how their journey would be received by a nation that had awaited news from the unknown territories with mixture of hope and anxiety. But the hero's welcome they received also highlighted the distance between their actual experiences and public understanding of what they had accomplished. Settlers who cheered their return imagined them as conquerors who had claimed empty wilderness for American expansion, when the reality was that they had survived through the generosity of indigenous peoples whose territorial rights and cultural sovereignty they had been forced to acknowledge at every stage of their journey. The final approach to St. Louis on September 23, 1806, transformed the expedition from wilderness survivors into national celebrities whose experiences would be interpreted and reinterpreted to support whatever version of American destiny seemed most politically useful. They had completed the most successful exploration in American history, but their success would be measured by its contribution to territorial expansion rather than by its revelations about the complexity and humanity of Western peoples. Lewis stood in the bow of their lead boat as St. Louis came into view, watching familiar buildings emerge from the Missouri River mists like images from a half-remembered dream. Behind him sat the maps, journals, and specimens that would reshape American understanding of Western geography. Beside him were the men who had crossed a continent and survived dangers that had killed experienced explorers before them. In the boat were York, whose freedom remained unacknowledged despite his essential contributions, and Sacagawea, whose knowledge had made their survival possible, but whose own dreams remained subordinated to the ambitions of others. The expedition that had begun as Thomas Jefferson's vision of continental empire was ending as something far more complex and morally ambiguous. They had proven that Americans could cross the continent, but they had also documented the existence of dozens of sovereign peoples whose displacement would be the true cost of territorial expansion. They had gathered scientific knowledge that would advance human understanding, but they had also created information that would guide military campaigns and settlement policies that would destroy the very cultures that had made their discoveries possible. As the boats touched the St. Louis waterfront and crowds gathered to celebrate their return, Lewis understood that their real journey was just beginning. The physical exploration was complete, but the interpretation of their experiences would continue for generations, shaping American attitudes toward Western expansion, indigenous peoples, and the moral costs of continental empire. The core of discovery had returned from the Pacific Ocean, but they had also returned from a confrontation with the complexity of North America that would challenge every simple assumption about American destiny. They were heroes, but they were also witnesses to realities that heroic narratives could not easily accommodate. Their success was undeniable, but its meaning would be debated as long as Americans struggled to understand what they had truly accomplished in the Western wilderness. The expedition that Thomas Jefferson had conceived as a search for the Northwest Passage had become instead a journey into the heart of American contradiction, the gap between ideals of equality and practices of expansion, between dreams of peaceful coexistence and realities of territorial acquisition, between individual courage and collective responsibility for the consequences of exploration. Lewis and Clark had crossed a continent and returned to tell the tale, but the story they brought back was larger and more troubling than the one they had been sent to discover. They had found the Pacific Ocean, but they had also found themselves and their nation reflected in ways that no map could ever capture.